Hello everyone, I'm the narrator, and I'm here to guide you through this story today. I know many of you use these videos to relax or fall asleep, so before we dive in, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? Get comfortable, take a deep breath, and relax. The first time I noticed something was wrong, it seemed like nothing at all, a trivial detail, really. My coffee mug wasn't where I'd left it. No big deal, right? At least, that's what I told myself. I live alone in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 4th floor of a decent building in Boston. No pets, no roommates, no cleaning service, just me. So, when I found my blue ceramic mug on the kitchen counter instead of in the sink, where I distinctly remembered leaving it the night before, I thought maybe I had absent-mindedly moved it. But then, small things started happening. A drawer in my bedroom, slightly open, even though I was sure I'd closed it. My keys on the coffee table instead of the hook by the door. The dining chair pushed a couple of inches away from the table. Each time, I shrugged it off. Stress from work. Lack of sleep. Reasonable explanations. Until the morning I found my laptop closed when I vividly remembered leaving it open to download updates overnight. That's when I felt the first pang of unease, a chill in the pit of my stomach. I checked the front door, locked. Deadbolt secured. Windows shut, no signs of forced entry. But something didn't feel right. I'm not the paranoid type. I work in software development. My world is facts, logic, code that either works or doesn't, no gray areas. So, I approached the situation rationally. First step, confirm whether something was really happening, or if I was just losing it. I bought a small security camera off Amazon. Nothing fancy, just a basic wireless model that connects to your phone. I set it up in the living room with a wide-angle view that captured most of the common areas and the hallway leading to the bedrooms. The camera had night vision, motion detection, and cloud storage for recordings. My plan was simple: either it would capture something, or it would prove that I was being ridiculous. The first 2 nights, nothing happened. The footage showed an empty apartment, with the occasional headlights of passing cars casting moving shadows on the walls. Completely normal. I started feeling foolish for even buying the camera. Then came the 3rd night. At 3:17 a.m., I woke up to a notification on my phone. The camera had detected motion. My hands trembled as I opened the app. The recording was clear, thanks to the infrared. I saw a tall, human-like figure slowly walking from the direction of my front door into the living room. The figure moved deliberately, as if they knew the space, as if they'd been there before. They were dressed in dark clothing and gloves, their face obscured by shadows and the camera's angle. They went to my desk first, opened the top drawer, and rummaged through it for about 30 seconds. Then they moved to my bookshelf, running their fingers along the spines of my books. My throat went dry as I checked the timestamp. This had happened just 4 hours earlier, while I was asleep in my bedroom, less than 40 feet away. But the worst part was still to come. The figure walked down the hallway, directly toward my bedroom. They stopped at my door, which was slightly ajar. And then, they just stood there. For 6 minutes. And for 23 seconds he stood perfectly still, watching me sleep. I could see his shadow on the hallway wall, motionless. Then, he turned around and began searching through the apartment, opening a few more drawers before leaving through the front door. I reviewed the footage from previous nights. There were 3 more incidents, all between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., always following the same pattern. The police weren't much help. I showed them the recordings, but without a clear facial identification or any sign of theft, they said there wasn't much they could do. They suggested I change the locks and file a report. The building management wasn't helpful either. They claimed only the maintenance staff had copies of the keys and that those were kept in a locked box. Regardless, they changed the locks and gave me a new set of keys, promising to investigate. I bought more cameras, 5 in total, 1 for every room except the bathroom. I installed motion sensor lights and door alarms. I added a chain lock and an additional deadbolt to the front door. I needed to know if they would come back and, most importantly, capture their face. A week passed without incidents. I barely slept, constantly checking the camera recordings every hour. Dark circles formed under my eyes. I jumped at every noise. My coworkers noticed something was off but avoided asking questions. How do you tell someone that a stranger has been watching you sleep? Then, last night, my phone vibrated. It was 3:22 a.m. A notification, motion detected in the living room. With trembling hands, I grabbed my phone. I could barely unlock it. They were back. The same dark clothes, the same careful movements. The new locks hadn't stopped them. I watched in real time as they moved through my apartment. This time, with multiple camera angles, I could follow their every step. When they reached the kitchen, one of the cameras caught their face. He looked up toward a cabinet, and I saw him clearly for the first time. A man probably in his 40s, thin, with graying hair at his temples. I didn't recognize him. He went about his routine, the desk, the drawers, the bookshelf. But this time, when he reached my bedroom door, something changed. He pushed it open wider than I had left it. I held my breath as I watched him enter. Except, I wasn't in my bed. I was sitting in my closet, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. Through my phone, I watched as he approached the carefully arranged pillows under the blankets. He stood by the bed for nearly a minute before realizing it was empty. His head shot up. Through the bedroom camera, I saw his face clearly for the first time. His eyes were wide, scanning the room. He knew something was wrong. Then he smiled. It wasn't a cruel smile, but something almost kind, understanding. He walked toward the closet door and stopped. I could hear his breathing through the wood. My phone displayed his face in detail as he reached for the handle. I tightened my grip on the baseball bat in my sweaty hands and held my breath. The handle turned. The door began to open. I was wondering when you'd stay awake for me, he said softly. I swung the bat as hard as I could. What happened next is burned into my memory as a series of disjointed fragments. The crack of the bat against his skull, his body hitting the floor of my bedroom, blood on the carpet, my trembling fingers dialing 911 incorrectly twice before finally getting it right. Red and blue lights flashing outside my window. Blue lights illuminated my window as police officers secured the scene. Paramedics declared him dead at 3:47 a.m. The first time I saw him, I didn't think much of it. That was my mistake. It was Tuesday, 11:43 p.m. in March. I remember glancing at my phone repeatedly, cursing the late bus. The Henderson Street stop was always deserted at that hour, just a metal bench under a flickering streetlight, surrounded by closed shops and empty sidewalks. The temperature had dropped to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and my thin jacket was no match for the biting wind. I was scrolling through emails when something caught my attention. A man was standing about 30 feet away near the dark entrance of Pitt's liquor store. He wore a black coat that reached his knees, his hands buried in his pockets, staring at the brick wall. Completely motionless. My finger froze mid-scroll. Something about his stillness sent a chill down my spine. Normal people don't stand in the cold, staring at walls. I forced myself to look back at my phone, but I kept him in my peripheral vision. 2 minutes passed. He didn't move. Not an inch. Finally, the bus lights appeared in the distance. I stood, shifting my weight from one foot to the other. The man stayed frozen. As the bus screeched to a stop, I glanced at him again. He had turned his head slightly, just enough for me to see the side of his face in the dim light. His skin was pale, almost gray. His eyes were fixed straight ahead, unblinking. I hurried onto the bus, sliding into a seat near the middle. Through the window, I watched him. He stayed there, unmoving, as we pulled away. I should have known better. 3 days later, I got home from work around 6 p.m. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across my front yard. I live in a small house on a quiet residential street, the kind of neighborhood where everyone's lived there for decades and knows everyone else's business. As I walked up the cracked concrete path with my keys in hand, something made me glance across the street. He was there. The same black coat. The same rigid posture. Standing perfectly still on the sidewalk across from my house, staring directly at my window. My stomach dropped. Fumbling with my keys, I rushed inside and locked the door. My hands trembled as I darted to the window, peeking through the blinds. He hadn't moved. He just stood there, head slightly tilted upward, eyes fixed on my second-floor bedroom window. I grabbed my phone and called the police. As it rang, I watched him closely. He didn't shift his position, didn't check his phone, he didn't even blink. The dispatcher answered, and I reported a suspicious person. She said a patrol car would be sent to check it out. 15 minutes later, blue and red lights flashed as a police car pulled onto my street. But he was gone. The officers knocked on my door. I described to them what I had seen. They nodded, took notes, but it was obvious they weren't concerned. Just another paranoid resident reporting a suspicious person. They told me to call again if I saw him that night. I double-checked all the locks before going to bed. I live alone, and suddenly, my house felt too big, too empty, too many windows, too many dark corners. I lay down staring at the ceiling, listening for any sound out of place. Around 2 a.m, a floorboard creaked somewhere downstairs. I sat up instantly, heart pounding. Just the house settling, I told myself. Old houses make noise. The next morning, I checked all the doors and windows. Everything was still locked, no signs of tampering. I went to work but couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting back to that pale, expressionless face, those unmoving eyes. Over the next week, I saw him 4 more times. Always at a distance, always completely still. Once outside my office during lunch, another in the supermarket parking lot as I loaded groceries into my car. Twice more outside my house on different streets, partially hidden behind trees or parked cars. Each time, I called the police, and each time he disappeared before they arrived. I started taking different routes to work, varied my schedule, constantly looked over my shoulder. I installed security cameras and motion sensor lights around my house. I bought pepper spray and kept it in my pocket. My coworkers noticed the bags under my eyes and asked if I was sleeping well. I made up excuses about insomnia. Then came the night that changed everything. I woke up at 3:17 a.m. to a notification on my phone. Motion detected, rear camera. I opened the app with trembling fingers. The infrared camera showed a figure standing in my backyard, head tilted toward my bedroom window. The same black coat. The same unnatural stillness. I called 911 immediately, whispering even though he was outside. As I waited for the police, I watched him through the camera feed. He didn't move. Not at all. Just stared at my window. Suddenly, the feed went black, connection lost. My breath caught in my throat. Then I heard it, a sound from downstairs, like something sliding across the wooden floor. Then slow, deliberate footsteps. I grabbed the pepper spray and my phone and moved silently to my bedroom door. The footsteps were climbing the stairs now. Step. Pause. Step. Pause. The wood creaked under each careful footstep. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. Sweat ran down my back. The steps reached the top of the stairs. A long pause. Then they started down the hallway toward my room. I pressed myself against the wall next to the door, trying to control my breathing. The footsteps came closer. Closer. They stopped just outside my door. I could hear soft breathing on the other side of the wood. The doorknob began to turn slowly. I raised the pepper spray, adrenaline flooding my body. The door creaked open, letting in a thin slice of darkness from the hallway. A pale hand gripped the edge of the door. When I saw his face appear, I sprayed. He recoiled with an inhuman scream, not of pain, but of rage, a sound no human should be able to make. I bolted for the stairs, taking them 3 at a time, nearly falling in my panic. Behind me, those methodical steps resumed. Step. Pause. Step. Pause. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't in a hurry, as if he knew he would eventually catch me. I reached the front door just as red and blue lights began flashing through the windows. I flung it open so I ran out barefoot in my pajamas, across the cold concrete. 2 police cars were arriving. The officers already had their weapons drawn. They searched my house but found no one. There were no signs of forced entry. The back door was still locked. The security camera worked perfectly, but in my bedroom, they found wet footprints on the hardwood floor. These weren't shoe prints. They were barefoot, much larger than any humans, with far too many toes. That night, I stayed in a hotel. Yes, that night, I stayed in a hotel. The next day, I started packing. I had lived in that house for 6 years, but I couldn't stay another night. I took a week off work and found a small apartment across town. I didn't give my new address to anyone. I installed security cameras at all the entrances and checked them every night. For 2 months, everything was calm. No more sightings. No more footsteps in the night. Gradually, I began to relax, convincing myself it was over. Until yesterday. I had stayed late at work and was waiting for the bus. The stop was deserted, the air was cold, and I was scrolling through my phone when something caught my eye. It stood about 30 feet away, near a closed store, the same black coat, hands in its pockets, staring at the wall. I ran. I didn't wait for the bus. I didn't call the police. I didn't look back. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs trembled. When I finally stopped, gasping for air outside a 24-hour diner, I saw him. He was standing across the street, watching. I'm writing this now from another hotel room. The glow of my laptop screen is the only light in the darkness. I've barricaded the door with a chair, though I know it won't help much. The curtains are closed, but I can almost imagine a shadow standing outside my third-floor window. I don't know what it wants. I don't know why it chose me. I don't know if it's human or something that only wears a human shape. All I know is that it has patience. It doesn't need to sleep. It doesn't need to eat. It can wait forever. And it's watching me right now. I can feel its eyes on me as I type this. The hairs on the back of my neck are standing on end. My hands tremble over the keyboard. There's a soft sound coming from the hallway outside my room. Step. Pause. Step. Pause. It's him. I know it's him. The footsteps are getting closer. The doorknob is starting to turn. I shouldn't have stopped at that motel. The neon sign said vacancy, in red letters, and after driving 16 hours straight, I was exhausted. I just wanted to sleep. Now I'm sitting in my car, hands trembling on the steering wheel, trying to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever happened in room 115. I need to write this while it's fresh. People need to know. It was 6 p.m. yesterday. I was driving back to Chicago from a meeting in Tennessee. My eyes kept closing on the road, and after my car swerved into the emergency lane for the 3rd time, I knew I had to stop. The Grove Motel was just off exit 237 in southern Indiana. The parking lot only had 3 cars. The paint on the wooden walls was peeling, and half of the exterior lights weren't working, and the office reeked of stale cigarettes. An older man sat behind the counter, watching Wheel of Fortune on a small television. His name tag simply read LL. "I need a room," I said, pulling out my wallet. He didn't take his eyes off the screen. "Single or double?" "Single is fine. $55 cash. Checkout's at 11. He slid a key across the counter, attached to a plastic tag with the number 115 written on it. My room was at the far end of the building. The door jammed when I tried to open it, and I had to shove it with my shoulder to get inside. There was a queen-sized bed with a faded blue comforter that took up almost the entire room. The carpet had dark stains near the bathroom door, and a small TV sat on a cheap particle board dresser. A single window overlooked the empty field behind the motel. I dropped my duffel bag and collapsed onto the bed without bothering to change. The springs groaned under my weight. From the neighboring room, Pat Sajik's voice leaked through the thin walls. I closed my eyes, ready to drift off to sleep. That's when I heard the first knock. 3 light taps, so soft, I almost ignored them. I opened my eyes but didn't move. Probably someone at the wrong door. The knocking came again, louder this time. Knock. 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 Wrong room! I called out. Silence for a few seconds. Then the doorknob started to turn, making a metallic, scraping sound. My heart froze. I sat up, staring at the handle as it slowly twisted back and forth. The door was locked. I had made sure to secure it with the deadbolt and chain when I came in. But seeing that knob move made my skin crawl. "Hey!" I shouted. "The door's locked. You've got the wrong room." The turning stopped. Footsteps. I heard them retreating, growing fainter until they disappeared. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Probably just some drunk, trying random doors. I told myself that and lay back down, but my heart was still pounding. 10 minutes passed. I started to drift off again. Bang! The door shook in its frame. I shot upright, adrenaline surging through me. Someone was throwing their full weight against the door. The chain rattled with every hit, the walls trembling from the force. I jumped out of bed, backing up until I hit the far wall. "I'm calling the police!" I shouted, grabbing my phone. No signal. Not a single bar. The banging stopped as abruptly as it had started. In the silence that followed, I could hear my own ragged breathing. The ceiling light began to flicker, dim, bright, dim, bright. The TV, which had been playing a rerun of Friends, crackled with static. The picture dissolved into snow, then went completely black. White words appeared on the screen. "I'm coming in." My legs felt like jelly. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. The bathroom lights started flickering too. The room's temperature plummeted at least 20 degrees. I could see my breath forming in small white puffs. The banging resumed on the door, but it was different now. A rhythm. Knock, knock. Pause. Knock, knock. Like someone politely asking to be let in. The TV changed again. "Let me in." "No," I whispered. "This isn't real." The knocking grew faster. More insistent. The lights flickered wildly, like a strobe. The room spun around me. A voice came from the TV, distorted, crackling. "You can't keep me out forever." I pressed my hands over my ears, but the voice only grew louder. "I'm already inside." The bathroom door slammed shut. Then, it slowly creaked open. And once again. Faster and faster, the front door shook in its frame. The chain was stretched tight, and the deadbolt began to turn on its own. I grabbed my phone and car keys and bolted for the door. Just as I reached the handle, everything stopped. The lights steadied, the TV turned off, the temperature returned to normal. Silence. My hand hovered inches from the doorknob. Sweat dripped down my back. Then, something scratched at the door from the other side. At first, it was soft. Then harder. Like animal claws scraping against wood. A whisper slipped through the crack. "Open the door." I stumbled backward. The voice wasn't coming from the TV. Someone, was right outside. "Open the door, David." I hadn't told anyone at the motel my name. The scratching moved up the door and then along the wall. I followed the sound as it circled the room, moving through the plaster like the wall wasn't even there. It reached the corner above the TV and stopped. I looked up. The ceiling was bulging downward, the wallpaper stretching and cracking. Something was pressing from above. A dark stain spread across the ceiling, dripping onto the floor. Water, or something worse. The bulge grew, straining the plaster to its limit. The TV turned on by itself. The screen showed a static-filled image of the room, my room. from an impossible angle. It was as if someone was recording from the ceiling. I saw myself on the screen, pale and terrified, staring upward. But there was no camera. The ceiling groaned. A crack opened, sending plaster dust raining down. Something pushed through the gap, a hand. But it was wrong. Too long, with too many joints. The fingers bent backward unnaturally. The TV spoke again, this time in my own voice. "You can't keep me out forever." I ran. I didn't bother unlocking the door. I slammed into it with my shoulder, breaking the chain. I sprinted across the parking lot at full speed, my keys jangling in my hand as I ran for my car. Behind me, the lights in room 115 flickered wildly, illuminating the window. I caught a glimpse of the words on the TV screen just before I threw open my car door. "See you soon." I started the engine, the tires skidding on the gravel as I sped away. In the rearview mirror, I saw a figure standing in the doorway of room 115. It raised an absurdly long arm and waved at me. That was 4 hours ago. I've been driving north ever since, sticking to main roads with plenty of traffic. The sun is rising now, and everything seems almost normal in the daylight. But my phone keeps glitching. Random messages appear. And then they disappear. The screen flickers sometimes, just for a second. A few minutes ago, I received a text from an unknown number. "Thanks for letting me in." I don't know what followed me from that motel. I don't know what it wants, but I know it's not done with me. The GPS says I'm 3 hours away from Chicago. My hands are trembling so much that I can barely hold the wheel. Every time I glance at the rearview mirror, I expect to see those long fingers reaching for the back of my neck. The sun is fully up now. Traffic is starting to build, cars around me, people heading to work or school, like it's just another Tuesday. None of them know what's out there. None of them know what's coming. My phone vibrates. Another message. "We're almost there." I press the gas pedal harder, but deep down, I know it doesn't matter. Whatever was in room 115. It's with me now. Maybe it always was. The radio turns on by itself. Through the static, I hear my own voice, laughing. Not words exactly, but a melody that makes my teeth ache and my head spin. I almost didn't go upstairs. I almost called Mr. Henderson to quit on the spot. But I've never been one to leave a job unfinished. The singing stopped as soon as my head poked into the stairwell. The shadow was there, in the center of the attic, more solid than ever. It turned to face me, and for the first time, I saw something like a face, dark voids where eyes should have been and a deeper black slash for a mouth. It raised an arm, pointing at me. The air turned so cold that my breath came out in white clouds. My flashlight flickered and died. In the darkness, I heard a lot of movement, like dozens of people crawling through the hay. But I couldn't see anything except that shadow, visible, even in the pitch black. I ran down the stairs so fast I skipped the last 3 steps and landed on my back. The wind was knocked out of me, but I didn't stop. I sprinted to the office, locked the door, and called Mr. Henderson. It was 2:30 a.m. He wasn't happy, but he listened. When I finished explaining everything, he said, "My grandpa used to tell stories about that barn. About things he'd seen in that attic when he was a kid. I always thought he was just trying to scare us, but now..." He went quiet for a long time. I could hear papers rustling on his end of the line. Then he said, "There was an accident, back in 1947. A worker got trapped up there during a hay fire. They never found his body. The whole top of the barn burned, but they rebuilt it. My grandpa used to say sometimes he'd find fresh hay scattered around, even when we hadn't had a new delivery in weeks. That was 5 hours ago. Now, the sun is rising. I'm still in the office, writing this as I wait for Mr. Henderson to arrive. He said he's bringing someone who specializes in paranormal agriculture. I didn't even know that was a thing. From the office window, The barn looks perfectly normal in the daylight. But I know I have to go back to the attic. I need to see what pattern the hay left this time, because there will be a pattern. There always is. My hands are shaking as I type this last part. I just got a text from Tommy, one of the morning shift workers. He got here early and went up to the attic. This time, the hay isn't scattered in a pattern. It's piled in the center of the floor. Fresh. With a sweet scent clinging to it, pressed as though something heavy had rested there, the shape of a body was clearly outlined. Tommy's message ended with a bewildered, "What the hell is going on here, Dan?" I didn't know how to respond. I stood there, staring at my phone, struggling to find the right words. But how do you explain something you don't understand? Finally, I just typed back, "Don't touch anything. I'm on my way with Mr. Henderson." From the office window, I could see Mr. Henderson's truck turning onto the gravel path. A woman sat in the passenger seat, holding a large briefcase on her lap. A worn-out backpack, with what looked like old books peeking out, was next to her. She wore thick glasses and a long coat that billowed as she stepped out of the vehicle. Her eyes immediately fixed on the barn, as though she already knew where to look. When I stepped outside to greet them, Mr. Henderson gave me a nod, his expression a mixture of worry and resignation. "Dan, this is Dr. Marion Groves," he said. "She knows about things like this." I wasn't sure what to say, so I just shook her hand. Dr. Groves studied me intently, her gaze piercing, as though she were sizing me up. Without a word, she turned toward the barn. "Show me the place," she said bluntly. Tommy was waiting by the barn door, his face pale, his hands trembling. When he saw Dr. Groves, relief washed over him, like someone had finally come to make sense of all this. But even so, he refused to follow us into the loft. "I'm not going up there again," he said firmly, stepping back. "I don't care what happens." We climbed the ladder with Dr. Groves leading the way, holding a strange device that hummed softly and blinked with tiny lights. Mr. Henderson and I followed close behind, flashlights in hand. When we reached the loft, the air was colder than usual, even though sunlight filtered through the cracks in the wood. Just as Tommy had described, the hay was piled neatly in the center of the floor, fresh, sweet-smelling, and in the middle of it was the unmistakable shape of a body. Arms stretched out to the sides, legs pressed together. Dr. Groves didn't look surprised. She pulled out a small camera and began taking pictures from every angle. Then she knelt beside the hay and started examining it carefully. "This isn't just an energy residue," she muttered. "This is much older." Mr. Henderson and I exchanged confused glances. "What does that mean?" I finally asked. Dr. Groves stood up, brushing her hands off. "It means that whatever is here isn't just a lost spirit. It's something that's been trapped for a very long time, and now, it's trying to communicate." She pointed to the north wall of the loft. "What's behind that wall?" Mr. Henderson frowned. "Nothing. Just the outer wall. It was reinforced after the fire." "Why? Has it ever been opened?" she asked. "No, never. There's never been a reason to." Dr. Groves sighed and pulled a small hammer from her briefcase. "I think it's time to take a look." It took more effort than we expected. The wood of the wall was solid, almost as if it were resisting us on purpose. But eventually, we managed to open a panel, revealing a hidden space behind it. The air that escaped was thick and stale, almost suffocating. The air smelled of something ancient, almost rotten. Inside the space, there was a small makeshift altar, constructed of stones and charred wood. On top of it rested a rusted metal bowl, surrounded by symbols carved into the walls. These symbols were an exact match to the patterns that had appeared in the hay over the past few weeks. But the most unsettling thing was at the center of the altar, a long, yellowed bone etched with markings on its surface. It looked like a human femur. Dr. Groves visibly stepped back, clearly disturbed. "This isn't some accident from the past," she murmured. This was a ritual. And someone, or something, has been trapped here. Something that wants to get out. Mr. Henderson swallowed hard, his face paler than I'd ever seen it. Can we stop it? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Groves glanced at him, then at the altar. Maybe, she said gravely. But it won't be easy. And no matter what happens, we cannot stop trying. Because if we don't, this won't end here. Whatever is in this barn, it's searching for something or someone. As Dr. Groves prepared what she called a counter-ritual, the air in the loft grew heavier, as if an invisible presence was watching us. I couldn't stop glancing toward the shadows forming between the hay bales, expecting to see that dark figure again. The worst part was knowing it wouldn't take long to appear. The night was closing in. Dr. Groves worked silently, placing candles and marking symbols on the floor with white chalk. Mr. Henderson and I stayed close, watching nervously. We didn't know exactly what to expect, but the growing tension in the air suggested that something was building. This won't be easy, Dr. Groves finally said, looking up at us. Whatever's here has been gaining strength for decades. Stopping it will require us to channel it into something else, something that can contain it. How do we do that? Mr. Henderson asked, his voice trembling. We'll use the altar as an anchor point, she replied. But I'll need your help. This place is strong, and it's likely to resist. My stomach tightened at the thought. Resist? How? I asked. That depends on its strength, she said. But be prepared for strange things. Very strange things. She handed each of us a lit candle and instructed us to repeat a chant. The words felt unnatural, almost otherworldly, as they rolled off my tongue. As we began, the atmosphere in the loft shifted immediately. The temperature plummeted, and the candle flames flickered but didn't go out. In the shadows, shapes started to move, first one, then two, then many more. They were humanoid but twisted, their movements erratic and deeply unsettling. Don't lose focus, Dr. Groves shouted over a wind that seemed to come from nowhere. Keep saying the words. I did my best to keep reciting, though my voice trembled. I could feel something approaching, something pressing against my mind, trying to invade my thoughts. Mr. Henderson gasped beside me, sweat dripping from his face despite the cold. Then it happened. One of the figures stepped fully out of the shadows, tall and a dark figure with what seemed like empty eyes that glowed like embers walked toward me, its movements unnatural, not human. Its presence froze me in place, paralyzing me. Dan! Shouted Mr. Henderson, pulling at my arm. That was enough to break the spell that seemed to hold me, and I managed to keep reciting the words. The figure stepped back, but the air felt heavier, as though it were fighting against us. Dr. Groves finished the last verse with a scream. The altar briefly blazed with blinding light, and then everything fell silent. The shadows faded, the pressure in the air lifted, and the attic returned to calm. We stood there, breathing heavily, as Dr. Groves knelt beside the altar, clearly exhausted. Is it over? I asked, hoping for a positive answer. She shook her head, slowly lifting her gaze toward us. It's not over, but we've sealed this part. Whatever was here won't be able to escape, at least not for now. Mr. Henderson and I exchanged a look. It wasn't the ending we'd hoped for, but it was better than nothing. What do we do now? Henderson asked. Dr. Groves got to her feet, wiping her hands with a cloth. Keep an eye on this place. If anything else happens, call me immediately. But remember, whatever was here has been trapped for so long. It won't be easy to keep it sealed. We left the attic as the daylight began to fade. That night, for the first time in weeks, I didn't see any shadows or hear any whispers. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't quite over. For now, the farm was at peace, but deep down, I knew whatever was summoned was still out there, waiting. That figure in the barn loft. It shouldn't have been there. No one goes up there at night. In fact, no one should ever go up there. I know this because I've worked on this farm for 15 years, and I'm the only one who works the night shift. But there it was, a dark shape moving against the moonlight that filtered through the cracks in the roof. I froze in the doorway, the beam from my flashlight illuminating only empty air where the figure had been just seconds before. The usual nighttime sounds of the farm continued around me, crickets chirping, the cattle shifting in their stalls, the distant hum of the generator. But something felt off. The air, it was different. Heavier somehow. My name is Dan Mitchell, and I've been the night supervisor at Riverside Farm since 2009. I know every corner of this place, every board that creaks, every loose nail. Mr. Henderson, the owner, trusts me to keep things running smoothly while everyone else sleeps. Usually, that means checking on the animals, making sure the equipment's in order, and I walked around the perimeter several times during my shift, but nothing exciting ever happens here after dark. Well, at least it never used to. Everything changed one Tuesday night in October. The temperature had dropped to the low 40s, and I was doing my usual 2 a.m. rounds. The main barn was always my first stop. It's the largest building on the property, housing most of our dairy cows and storage. I had just finished checking the temperature of the milk tank when I heard it, the soft creak of something moving across the wooden floor just above me. I pointed my flashlight toward the ceiling. The beam caught dust particles floating in the air, but nothing else seemed out of place. Then I heard it again, a distinct sound of footsteps coming from the attic. My first thought? Raccoons. We get them sometimes, especially during the colder months when they seek shelter. But this sound was too heavy, too deliberate to be a raccoon. The ladder to the attic creaked under my weight as I climbed. Each step made my heart beat faster. Normally, I'm not a jumpy person, but something about this felt different from the usual nighttime disturbances. When I reached the top, I swept my flashlight across the attic space. Hay bales were stacked almost to the ceiling on my right, creating narrow pathways between them. To my left, there was an open space that stretched all the way to the back wall, where we stored loose hay. That's when I saw it. A shadow, human-shaped, moving between the hay bales. It was tall, maybe over 6 feet, and it moved in a way that made my skin crawl. It didn't walk, it didn't run, it seemed to glide. The beam of my flashlight passed directly through the spot where it had been, illuminating nothing but hay and old wood. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice echoing in the vast empty space. "This is private property." There was no reply. Just the usual barn sounds and my own breathing, which had quickened without me realizing. I moved forward, checking between every row of bales. Nothing. No footprints in the dust, no disturbed hay, no signs that anyone had been there. I spent another 20 minutes searching the entire attic, every corner, every possible hiding spot. Nothing. Finally, I convinced myself I had imagined it. Too many sleepless nights, too much coffee, my eyes playing tricks on me in the dark. I went down the ladder and finished my rounds. The next morning, before heading home, I passed by the barn like I always do. Everything seemed normal at first, until I noticed it. There was fresh hay scattered on the attic floor, forming an irregular circle about 3 meters wide. The nearby bales were untouched, their strings still tight. But something about that circle of hay made my stomach drop. It's not broken, but that hay, it was definitely new. I could smell it, the sweet scent of fresh grass that vanishes after a few days of being stored. I know exactly when each delivery arrives at this farm. We hadn't gotten any new hay in weeks, and no one, absolutely no one, had been up in that attic. Between my night shift and the morning, the doors stay locked, and I have the only key. One night, I took pictures with my phone and sent them to Mr. Henderson. He came over to check it out for himself, but he didn't have an explanation either. We reviewed the security cameras, but all we got were images of the outside of the barn, empty, all night long. No one coming in, no one leaving. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, it's happened a few more times. Always the same pattern. I see the shadowy figure in the attic. It disappears when I investigate, and by the next morning, there's fresh hay, scattered in strange shapes. Sometimes it's a circle, other times a square. One time, it even looked like an arrow pointing towards the north wall of the barn. I've started keeping track of each incident. October 15th, first sighting, a circle of hay. October 18th, brief shadow, square pattern the next morning. October 23rd, more visible shadow, seemed to be watching me, triangular pattern. October 27th, 2 shadows this time, an arrow pointing north. November 1st, the shadow moved erratically, spiral pattern. November 5th, I heard whispers next to the shadow, star-shaped pattern. Last night, on November 8th, the shadow actually tried to reach me. I haven't gone up to the attic yet. The other workers think I'm losing it. They laugh and joke about Dan's ghost during shift changes, but they aren't here at night. They don't feel the heaviness in the air when the shadow shows up, and they don't hear the whispers that sound almost like words, but not quite. Mr. Henderson suggested installing cameras in the attic, so last week we put up 4, covering every angle. They record everything onto a hard drive in the office. But every time an incident happens, the footage shows nothing but empty space where I saw the shadow. The hay is still there, scattered in those strange patterns, but there's no record of how it got there. The cameras don't fail, they don't glitch like in those ghost hunter shows. They only capture empty air. I've tried other things, set up traps with strings, sprinkled flour on the floor to capture footprints, even brought my German Shepherd, Rex, one night. But the dog just whimpered and he refused to climb the stairs. Last night was different. Last night changed everything. I was doing my usual checkup at 2 a.m. when I heard something new from the attic, singing. No one else should have been there, not at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. The parking lot was my personal concrete cave at that hour. It had been for the last 3 years of night shifts at Morton and Associates, until tonight. The footsteps started when I was on the 3rd level. At first, I thought it was just the sound of my dress shoes against the concrete, the usual echo bouncing off the low ceiling. But then I stopped. The footsteps continued. I froze, the heavy briefcase in my right hand, listening. The sound was coming from somewhere behind me, the click of hard soles against solid concrete, firm and deliberate. My heartbeat quickened. I turned slowly, scanning the rows of empty parking spaces and concrete pillars. Nothing moved under the harsh fluorescent light. The footsteps stopped too. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding weaker than I intended, swallowed by the vast emptiness around me. No response. I began walking again, faster this time, trying to keep my steps silent. My car was just ahead, my black Honda Civic parked alone in the corner, where I always left it, far from the daylight cars that had long since disappeared. I didn't dare turn around. I couldn't. I stood there, staring at the screen of my phone, listening. Then I heard it, the soft click of dress shoes on wooden floors, coming from somewhere in my apartment. The footsteps were getting closer. Now they were in the hallway outside my bedroom. I'm sitting at my desk, writing this as fast as I can because people need to know what happened to me. The door handle is turning slowly. They're here. The Buick is still waiting every night, somewhere on an empty road. The old car is parked with its windows fogged up and handprints shifting. And if you ever decide to take the detour to a diner in the middle of nowhere, maybe you'll find it. Maybe he'll be waiting for you. The sun had barely disappeared behind the mountains when I saw the gas station sign on the side of the road. The gas gauge was dangerously close to empty, and the warning light was already flashing. I had no choice. I took the exit, leaving the main highway behind. The road was narrow, flanked by tall trees that darkened the sky. Eventually, the little station appeared in front of me, an old, rusty pump beside a flickering fluorescent sign. A feeling of unease settled in my chest as I slowed down and parked next to one of the pumps. The place was empty, except for an old car, a black Buick, parked under the dim light of a street lamp. Its windows were fogged up, but I didn't see any signs of movement. I opened the door of my car and the cold air hit me, taking a part of my nervousness with it. I walked toward the pump, pulled out the nozzle, and started filling the tank. The counter turned slowly, each click echoing in the silence. As I waited, I looked around. There was no one in the small convenience store next to the pumps. Even with the lights on, the place seemed abandoned, desolate. My eyes drifted back to the wick. Something wasn't right. There were fingerprints on the fogged-up glass, but they weren't static. They moved, like someone was pressing their hands against the inside and dragging them along. My throat went dry. I couldn't look away. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from the other side of the pump. I turned instinctively, my heart pounding. There was nothing. Just the shadow of my car under the light. I glanced back at the buck, but this time, there were no marks on the windows. They were clean. The tank made a click, signaling it was full. I quickly replaced the nozzle, eager to leave. But something stopped me. The Buick's door opened slowly, the metallic sound cutting through the air. I saw a leg step out of the car, then another. A tall, thin figure straightened up, adjusting its hat. I couldn't see its face. I took a step back, my breath coming out in quick, shallow gasps. I didn't want to turn my back, but my legs were shaking, wanting to run. The figure began walking toward me. Its steps were slow and deliberate, crunching the gravel with each movement. "Hey!" I shouted, trying to sound firm. "What do you want?" It didn't respond. Its gait was strange, too fluid, like it didn't have joints. I took another step back, then another. My hand fumbled in my pocket for the keys, but my clumsy fingers dropped them to the ground. The figure stopped just a few feet away from me. Now, in the light, I could see its face. It had no eyes, just two black, empty sockets where they should have been. A wide, disproportionate smile stretched across its face, with teeth too sharp and unnaturally bright under the dim lighting. "Do you need help?" it asked. Its voice was distorted, as if several people were speaking at once. I didn't wait to find out more. I bent down, grabbed the keys, and ran toward my car. I jumped in, slammed the doors shut, and started the engine. But the Buick wasn't behind me. I looked in the rearview mirror again and again as I sped away. The road was empty. But then, the phone on the passenger seat vibrated. A message from an unknown number popped up on the screen. "Why are you leaving so quickly?" "I just wanted to chat." I glanced in the rearview mirror. The yellow headlights of the Buick were there again, unwavering, as if I'd never escaped. The yellow headlights of the Buick stayed behind me, unmoving. Every time I checked the mirror, I felt like they were getting closer, just a little bit more, yet they kept the exact same distance, as if they were toying with me. I slammed my foot on the gas. The Honda's engine roared as I pushed it to 80 miles per hour. The road was straight, lined with trees that closed in like threatening shadows. The phone buzzed again on the passenger seat. Another message appeared on the screen. "You're wasting your time running. I'm always here." I ignored it, focusing on the road. But inside, my mind was a storm. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight that my knuckles went white. Then, the Buick's headlights disappeared. For a moment, I thought it was over. My chest loosened just a little. My breathing began to calm, but just when I thought I was safe, the lights of the Buick reappeared, this time directly in front of me, coming at me from the opposite direction. My reflexes kicked in, and I jerked the steering wheel, swerving off the road and onto the gravel. My car skidded before finally coming to a stop in a small clearing. The engine of the Buick roared as it sped past me, but it didn't continue its way. Instead, it slowly turned around and stopped a few meters away, blocking my escape. My phone vibrated again. It's time to end this. The door of the Buick opened, and the figure from before stepped out. His body was illuminated by the yellowish headlights, and that same wide, disproportionate smile was still stretched across his face, as if he reveled in the fear I felt. He walked toward me, his steps echoing on the gravel. I opened my car door, but my legs felt heavy, like my body was refusing to move. "Why do you always run?" he asked, tilting his head unnaturally. "This is inevitable." My heart pounded in my chest so fast, I thought I was going to pass out. Then, the figure raised a hand, and the Buick's lights began to flicker erratically. The light danced across the clearing, illuminating something I hadn't noticed before: shadows. But these weren't ordinary shadows. No, these were sinister, dark figures. Every tree, every rock cast long, twisted shapes that moved on their own, converging toward my car. Suddenly, I felt a cold chill run down my neck. "I warned you," said a voice behind me. I didn't have time to react before everything went black. I woke up in my car, parked on the side of the highway. The sun was rising, and traffic was beginning to fill the road. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 6:47 in the morning. Everything seemed normal. My phone was on the passenger seat, with no new messages. The gas tank was full, though I had no memory of refueling it. I slowly sat up, feeling a sharp pain in my neck. When I looked in the rearview mirror, I noticed a dark mark on my skin, like a cold hand had been pressed against it. The Buick was gone, but I knew this wasn't the end. Every time I pass a gas station now, I check the parked cars carefully. I look for fogged-up windows and handprints. Because I know he's still out there, waiting. And the next time, I might not be so lucky. I shouldn't have stopped at that motel. The sign said vacancy, in red neon, and it was almost empty. After driving for 16 hours straight, I just wanted a place to sleep. But now, as I drive with my hands trembling on the wheel, trying to push away the memories of what happened in room 115, I know it was a mistake. I have to write this down before it's too late, before I forget the details. People need to know what happened. It was around 6 p.m. when I decided to stop. I was driving back to Chicago after a meeting in Tennessee, but my eyes kept closing. For the third time, my car veered off the shoulder and hit the rough strips of the road. The Grove Motel came into view, right off exit 237, in southern Indiana. The paint on the building was peeling, and only 3 cars were parked in the lot. Half the exterior lights were out. I walked into the office, where the air was thick with the stench of stale cigarettes. Behind the counter, an older man sat watching Wheel of Fortune on a tiny TV. His name tag read, Earl. "I need a room," I said, pulling out my wallet. Earl didn't take his eyes off the screen. "Single or double?" "Single. 55 cash. Checkout's at 11. He slid a key across the counter. It had a plastic tag that read, 115. My room was at the far end of the building. I had to push the door open with my shoulder. Inside, there was a queen-size bed with a faded blue bedspread, and a small TV sitting on a cheap dresser. The wallpaper was yellowed, and there was a lingering sense of neglect in the air. The carpet had dark stains near the bathroom. I dropped my travel bag onto the floor and collapsed onto the bed. I didn't even bother to change. The mattress creaked under my weight, and through the thin walls, I could hear someone watching TV in the next room. I closed my eyes, ready to sleep. But then I heard the first knock. 3 quick knocks, so light that I almost didn't notice them. I opened my eyes but didn't move, probably someone at the wrong door. Then the knock came again. This time, louder. "Knock, knock, knock. You've got the wrong room," I shouted. No answer. After a few seconds, the doorknob began to turn, making a metallic, scraping sound. My heart skipped a beat, pounding in my chest. I sat up, watching as the handle slowly moved side to side. I knew I had locked the door. I had also secured the chain and the deadbolt. But seeing that doorknob turning made my skin crawl. "Hey, the door's locked! You're at the wrong room!" I yelled. The doorknob stopped moving. I heard footsteps retreating, fading until they disappeared completely. I let out a long breath. It must have been some drunk guy trying random doors. I lay back down, but my heartbeat was still racing. About 10 minutes passed. I was starting to fall asleep again when suddenly, bang! The door shook violently in its frame. I shot up, adrenaline coursing through my body. Someone was slamming into the door with full force. The chain rattled with each hit. I jumped out of bed and backed up to the far wall. "I'm calling the police!" I shouted, pulling my phone out of my pocket. No signal. Not a single bar. The banging stopped suddenly. The room was eerily silent, except for my rapid, shallow breathing. Then, the overhead light began to flicker. Dim, bright. Dim, bright. The TV, which had been playing an episode of Friends, crackled with static. The picture vanished, leaving only a black screen. Then, in white letters, words appeared. "I'm coming in." My legs went weak. This couldn't be happening. The bathroom started making noises. The door was opening and slamming shut again and again. The deadbolt on the front door started to turn on its own. The room's temperature plummeted, to the point where I could see my breath in the air. "You can't keep me out forever," a distorted voice said, coming from the TV. I grabbed my keys and phone and ran toward the door. I slammed my shoulder into it, breaking the chain, and bolted for my car. When I got to the parking lot, I glanced back. Room 115 was flashing like a beacon, the lights flickering, casting an eerie glow on the inside. Through the window, I could see the words on the screen. "See you soon." I started the engine and sped off, gravel flying behind the tires. In my rearview mirror, I saw a figure standing at the door of room 115. It raised a long arm and waved at me. That was 4 hours ago. I've been driving non-stop north, sticking to the main highways, surrounded by other cars. The sunlight is starting to light up the horizon, and everything seems almost normal as the day breaks. But something's off. My phone keeps acting strange, random messages pop up, and then the screen flickers. For just a second, and then it goes back to normal. A few minutes ago, I received a message from an unknown number. "Thank you for letting me in." Sweat soaks my hands as I grip the steering wheel. I don't know who followed me from that motel. I don't know what they want, but I know they're not done with me yet. The GPS says I'm 3 hours away from Chicago. My eyes constantly scan the rearview mirror, hoping to see something, hoping to see him. Traffic begins to pick up. People are on their way to work, or dropping their kids off at school, like it's just another Tuesday. None of them know what's out there. None of them know what's coming. My phone vibrates again. Another message. "We're almost there." I press harder on the gas, but deep down, I know it doesn't matter. Whatever was in room 115 is with me now. Maybe it always has been. The radio turns on by itself. Through the static, I hear a laugh. It's my laugh. I don't remember laughing like that. The first sign that something was wrong came with the creaking sound of the wooden floorboards downstairs. It was 2:47 in the morning, and the house was pitch black. I live alone, so hearing any noise at that hour was enough to make my heart race. I lay still in bed, holding my breath. The sound repeated, a slow, deliberate creak, like someone was moving carefully, trying not to make too much noise. At first, I thought it might have been the wind or the old heating system, but I quickly ruled that out. The footsteps were too distinct, too human. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and turned on the flashlight. I didn't want to call the police yet. Maybe it was just paranoia. Maybe I was imagining things. I slipped on my slippers and crept toward my bedroom door. I opened it slowly, the sound of the hinges breaking the silence. The hallway was empty, lit only by the dim light of the moon filtering through a window at the far end. "Hello?" I called. My voice barely a whisper. There was no answer. I slowly descended the stairs, holding my phone like a weapon. Each step made a small noise against the wood, and I could feel every creak betraying my position. When I reached the first floor, I scanned the area with the phone's light. Everything was in its place: the sofa, the coffee table, the shelves, except for the back door. It was slightly ajar. I approached carefully, my breath shallow and quick. The cold air flowed through the gap in the door, causing the hairs on my arms to stand on end. I reached out and slammed the door shut, twisting the lock tightly as I did. As I turned the key, I heard another sound. This time, it didn't come from the floor. It came from behind me, right behind me. It was a whisper, so faint I almost didn't catch it. "You shouldn't have done that." I spun around suddenly, flashing the light through the room. There was no one there. I ran toward the kitchen. I grabbed a knife from the block, my mind racing 1,000 miles per hour as I tried to find a rational explanation. Maybe it was the wind, I told myself. Perhaps I left the door open without realizing it. But then, the sound of something dragging across the floor above me shattered my train of thought. The knife, trembling in my hand, as I looked toward the stairs, something was in my room. The dragging sound from upstairs was slow, deliberate, as if someone, or something, was moving carefully, trying not to make too much noise. I gripped the knife tighter, trying to gather enough courage to climb the stairs. My breathing was fast and shallow, each inhale echoing too loudly in the silence of the house. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. There was no answer, just a continuous dragging sound coming from my bedroom. I took the first step, then the second. The wood creaked under my weight, and I stopped, waiting for any kind of reaction. Nothing. Halfway up the stairs, the house fell into an absolute silence. The dragging sound had stopped. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to listen for any other noise. When I reached the top, the hallway was just as I had left it, empty, bathed in the pale light of the moon. My room was at the end, the door slightly ajar, exactly as I had left it. I moved slowly, my sweaty hand gripping the knife. The air here felt colder, as if someone had left a window open. But I knew that wasn't possible. I had checked all the locks before going to bed. I pushed the door open carefully, and the light from my phone illuminated the inside. The bed was messy, the sheets tossed onto the floor. The window was still shut, and the closet was slightly open, revealing only impenetrable darkness. I entered, my eyes scanning every corner. I approached the closet, each step feeling like an eternity. I grabbed the closet door with one hand, the knife ready in the other. With a swift movement, I threw it open, empty. I exhaled a sigh of relief, lowering the knife slowly. Maybe I had been imagining things. Then I saw it, a reflection in the mirror next to the bed. It was a tall, hunched figure standing behind me. Its face was blurry, but its eyes, bright, glowing eyes, burned in the darkness. I spun around immediately, raising the knife. There was no one there. The air around me felt heavier, as if something invisible filled the room. I heard a whisper, clearer this time, as if it was coming from everywhere. "Why do you close the doors?" My throat tightened, and a chill ran down my spine. Suddenly, the door to my room slammed shut, the sound echoing through the house. My phone fell to the floor, the light flickering erratically before turning off. I was plunged into darkness. The sound of rapid footsteps echoed down the hallway, and something slammed into the door with force. One after another. And once again, as if trying to get in, I screamed, my voice broken by the panic. The banging stopped immediately. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, a final whisper, almost a murmur. I'm inside. My hand trembled as I tried to pick up the phone from the floor, but it didn't work. The battery was dead, or at least that's what it seemed like. Something moved behind me, and the cold was the last thing I felt before everything went black. I slowly opened my eyes, my limbs numb and my mind foggy. I was lying on the floor of my room. The morning light was creeping through the window. I sat up with difficulty, every muscle in my body protesting from the effort. Everything seemed normal, but something was off. The sheets were still thrown on the floor, and my knife was just a few inches away from me. My phone was still turned off, its screen cracked, but what truly unsettled me was the mirror. There was something written on it with twisted, uneven letters as if someone had scratched it with long nails. See you soon. I instinctively backed away, stumbling over the corner of the bed. I looked around, hoping to find some sign of what had happened, but everything else seemed untouched. I rushed toward the mirror, trying to wipe away the words with my sleeve, but they wouldn't move. They weren't surface marks, they were etched into the glass. The sound of my breathing filled the room. It was the only noise, after what felt like an eternity. I picked up my phone and headed for the bathroom. I needed water. I needed something to ground me, something to reconnect me to reality. The cold water on my face gave me some clarity, but when I lifted my head to look in the bathroom mirror, the reflection wasn't mine. It was the figure from the previous night. Its eyes gleamed in the dim light, and its smile was wider than any human mouth should be capable of showing. "I told you not to close the doors," it whispered, the words echoing in my head. I screamed, stumbling backward, but tripped over something that hadn't been there before. The knife had reappeared, right behind me. I picked it up instinctively, but when I turned around, the bathroom was empty. The mirror reflected only my pale, disheveled face. I ran out of the house without looking back, the knife still in my hand. My breath was ragged as I jumped into the car and started the engine. I glanced one last time toward the window of my bedroom. The figure was there, staring at me, with one hand raised as if waving. I slammed on the gas and sped away as fast as I could. Since that night, I haven't returned to my house. I'm living in a motel, with the lights always on and the doors reinforced with furniture. I can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I hear the whisper. I'm inside. I'm not sure here. I know I'm not safe anywhere. It's been days since I left my house. I checked into a cheap motel on the edge of the highway, far from the city. I thought that by putting distance between myself and that house, things would go back to normal. But they didn't. It all started again. The second night in the motel, I was lying in bed, the lights on, when the kitchen knife from the motel sat resting on the nightstand. I hadn't gotten much sleep since what happened at my house, and the exhaustion was taking over. Slowly I drifted off, but suddenly, a sharp thud woke me. My eyes shot open, my heart racing. At first, I thought I imagined it, but then I heard it again. A heavy thump, like something was slamming against the door to my room. I glanced at the clock on the wall. 3:17 a.m. I got up slowly, the knife already in my hand. The thud came again, followed by a rhythmic scratching sound, like nails against wood. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice weaker than I expected. The first time I saw him, I didn't think much of it. It was just any Tuesday night, 11:43 p.m., on a cold March evening. I was waiting at the bus stop on Henderson Street, cursing the bus for being late. The stop was always deserted at that hour, just a metal bench under a flickering street light, surrounded by closed shops and empty sidewalks. The cold wind cut through my thin jacket, making me shiver. I was checking my emails on my phone when something caught my attention. A man was standing about 30 feet away, near the dark entrance of Pete's liquor store. He wore a long black coat that reached his knees. His hands were shoved into his pockets, and he stood motionless, staring at the brick wall. My finger froze mid-scroll. Something about his stillness made me uneasy. Normal people don't just stand like that, in the cold, staring at walls. I tried to refocus on my phone, but I kept him in my peripheral vision. 2 minutes passed, and he hadn't moved an inch. Finally, the bus's lights appeared in the distance. I shifted my weight from one foot to the other, restless. The man remained frozen. When the bus squealed to a stop, I glanced quickly at him before getting on. He turned his head slightly, just enough for me to see the side of his face. His skin was pale, almost gray, his eyes locked forward, unblinking. I hurried onto the bus, sliding into a seat. My heart raced faster than it should have. I told myself I was being paranoid. Cities are full of strange people, and I'd probably never see him again. I was wrong. 3 days later, I came home from work around 6 p.m. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the neighborhood. I live in a small house on a quiet residential street, the kind of place where everyone knows their neighbors, and I was going about my usual routine when something made me glance over at the sidewalk across the street. There he was. The same black coat. The same rigid stance. He was standing perfectly still, staring directly at my house, right at the second-floor window. My stomach dropped. With trembling hands, I fumbled to get my keys into the lock. I pushed the door open, slammed it shut behind me, and bolted toward the window. I pulled the curtains aside just a little and looked outside. He was still there, his head tilted slightly upward, eyes locked on my window. I grabbed my phone, dialed 911, and while it was ringing, I couldn't take my eyes off him. He didn't move. He didn't look away. He didn't blink. I explained to the operator that there was a suspicious man outside my house, and she told me an officer would be on the way. 15 minutes later, the red and blue lights of a patrol car illuminated my street. I looked outside, but he was gone. The officer knocked on my door, and I told him everything I had seen. He nodded, took some notes, and said they'd patrol the neighborhood. But deep down, I knew they wouldn't take it seriously. Who would? That night, I checked the locks 3 times before finally going to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. I lay awake in the dark, listening for any strange noises. Around 2 a.m., I heard a creak from downstairs. My heart pounded as I jumped out of bed. I told myself it was just the house, an old building settling, but I couldn't go back to sleep. Over the next week, I saw him several more times. Always in different places, always watching. In the office parking lot, at the grocery store while I loaded my bags into the car, and twice outside my house. Every time, I called the police, but by the time they got there, he was already gone. My nerves were shot. I installed security cameras, motion sensor lights, and carried pepper spray in my pocket. I changed my daily routine, taking different routes to work and coming home at odd hours, hoping to throw him off. Then, one night, everything changed. I woke up at 3:17 a.m. to a notification on my phone. Motion detected backyard camera. My hands were shaking as I opened the app. There he was, standing in my backyard, his face tilted toward my bedroom window. The same black coat. The same unmoving posture. I dialed 911, whispering as I watched the live feed. I told them there was someone on my property. While waiting for the police to arrive, he didn't budge. He just kept staring at my window. Suddenly, the feed went black. Connection lost. My breath caught in my throat. Then I heard it, a soft sound at first, like something sliding across the floor. Then footsteps. Slowly, they started making their way up the stairs of my house. I grabbed the pepper spray and my phone and hid behind my bedroom door. I heard every creak of the steps, every deliberate pause between them. Step. Pause. Step. Pause. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I heard quiet, steady breathing. The doorknob slowly began to turn. With adrenaline surging through my body, I raised the pepper spray. And his face. I sprayed it. What I heard wasn't a human scream. It was an inhuman roar, a sound of pure rage. I jumped past him and ran towards the stairs, taking them 3 at a time. I couldn't dare look back. I opened the front door just as the red and blue lights of the patrol cars lit up the street. I ran toward the officers, screaming for help. They searched the house, but they found no one. All the doors and windows were locked, and the cameras were working normally. However, on the hallway floor, they found wet footprints. They weren't shoe prints. They were large, barefoot prints, bigger than normal, with too many toes. I stayed at a hotel that night. The next day, I packed up and changed my routine again, avoiding any connection to my old life. For 2 months, everything was calm. Then last night, as I was waiting for the bus late in the night, I saw him again, standing under a street lamp, staring at the brick wall like he did the first time. I ran without looking back, and now, I'm writing this from another hotel, the door secured with a chair. But no matter what I do, he always finds me. He doesn't need to sleep. He doesn't need to eat. He can wait forever, and I know that one day, I won't be able to escape. Silence. I carefully approached the door, looking through the peephole. The hallway was empty. The air around me felt heavier, as if something invisible was filling the room. A sudden cold ran through my body, and the scratching sound stopped. Then, the phone in the room rang. The ring startled me, almost making me drop the knife. I looked at the phone, paralyzed with fear. Finally, I gathered the courage to pick up the receiver. "Hello?" I asked, my voice trembling. For a moment, I heard nothing, then a familiar whisper came through the line. "I knew you couldn't escape." I hung up immediately, my hand shaking. The silence returned, but not for long. A low, constant sound began filling the room, like a murmur coming from all directions at once. The TV, which had been off since I arrived, turned on by itself. At first, the screen showed static, but then the words started to form. "You can't run." I backed into the wall, my breath out of control. The screen flickered, and for an instant, I saw the figure again, smiling with those black eyes like the void. The lights in the room flickered, and the knife fell from my hands when something cold touched my shoulder. I turned around, but there was no one. "Leave me alone!" I screamed, my voice breaking. The murmur turned into a deafening scream. The TV exploded into sparks, and the lights went out suddenly, plunging the room into complete darkness. In the silence, a whisper. "I'm always inside." On the floor, surrounded by broken glass, the ceiling lights flickered, and the room was in total disarray. I don't know how I got out of there, but I'm writing this from my car, parked somewhere on the side of the road. I know this isn't over. I can feel it. Every shadow, every reflection, every sound reminds me that I'm not alone. I don't know how much longer I can keep running. I'm fleeing without a destination. The roads seem endless, and my reflection in the rearview mirror shows a face I don't recognize. Deep bags under my eyes, a pale face, and my eyes are filled with paranoia. The car starts to flicker with warning lights on the dashboard. My fuel tank is almost empty, and my options are running out fast. Finally, I see a sign on the side of the road, "Gas station, 2 miles ahead." I hesitate. I don't want to stop, but I have no choice. The engine won't make it much farther. When I arrive, the place is in ruins, an old, rusted gas station with a single pump that looks like it hasn't worked in years. The neon sign flickers weakly, saying, "Open," but no one seems to be around. I take a deep breath and step out of the car. The wind blows cold and dry, carrying with it a strange metallic scent. I walk toward the pump, hoping it will work, but when I try to use it, the nozzle is stuck. "Perfect," I mutter to myself, frustrated. I look over at the convenience store. Lights are on inside, though the windows are covered in dust. I gather my courage and go inside. The door lets out a sharp screech as it opens, and the smell of dampness and mildew hits me instantly. The shelves are half empty, with expired products and dust collecting in every corner. "Hello?" I call, my voice echoing in the empty space. No one answers. I walk toward the counter, where there's a small bell. I ring it, the sound reverberating like an eerie echo in the silence. Then, a figure appears behind the counter so suddenly that I jump back. It's an older man, his wrinkled face and sunken eyes shadowed by the dim light. I didn't hear him coming. "You need something?" he asks in a gravelly voice. "Gasoline," I reply, trying to keep my voice steady. The man nods slowly, almost as if he's processing my words. He points to a panel on the wall. "Activate the pump from there," he says. Something about his voice makes me uneasy. There's a coldness to it, as though he's seeing right through me. I walk toward the panel, but I can't shake the feeling that something is off. I activate the pump and rush back to my car, glancing around every second. Then I see it. The black Buick is parked across the lot, its windows fogged up and handprints smudged on the glass. My heart races. I jump into the car, slam the key into the ignition, and the engine roars to life. I speed off toward the road, not daring to look back. But then, the phone on the passenger seat vibrates. Unknown number. A message flashes on the screen. "Where do you think you're going? I'm still here." I throw the phone onto the floor, but the buzzing continues, echoing in my ears like a scream. The yellow headlights of the Buick appear in my rearview mirror, following me at an exact, unbreakable distance. And deep inside I know the truth. No matter how far I run, no matter how much I hide, it's always inside me. The Buick stays at the same distance, as if it's toying with me. The yellow headlights illuminate the road behind me, but never enough for me to see the driver, if there even is one. My breathing becomes erratic, my mind struggling to stay logical. There's no way out of this. I can't stop, and I can't keep driving forever. The road begins to wind. The trees on both sides closed in like living shadows, their branches twisting toward me, almost as if they were reaching out. I glanced at the gas gauge. I had just filled the tank, but the needle was already dropping faster than usual, as if something was draining it. My phone continued to vibrate on the floor. I picked it up with trembling hands. The screen displayed a new message from that unknown number. "No matter where you go, you're already trapped." The Buick accelerated. In the rearview mirror, I saw it closing in, the distance shrinking between us. My foot pressed harder on the gas pedal, but my car trembled, the engine roaring in protest. The road ahead split into two forks, no signs to guide me. Without thinking, I veered to the right, the tires screeching. The Buick followed suit, turning with me. The path narrowed, and the tree branches scraped along the sides of my car like fingers trying to grab me. The Buick was so close now, I could hear the low growl of its engine. Then, suddenly, the Buick's headlights blazed on. For a moment, everything went silent, except for the sound of my own engine and my frantic, uncontrolled breathing. That's when I saw it. The Buick was right in front of me, stationary, blocking the road. The windows were no longer fogged up. They were wide open, and there, sitting in the driver's seat, was a familiar face staring back at me. It was my face, my eyes, but darker, almost hollow, with a twisted smile creeping across its lips. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding on the gravel. I stumbled out, my legs shaky, the cold night air wrapping around me. The Buick remained there, its engine humming softly. The driver didn't move. "What do you want from me?" I screamed, my voice echoing in the forest. The figure in the driver's seat tilted its head, its smile stretching wider. Then, the Buick's door creaked open slowly. I didn't wait to see who, or what, was stepping out. I bolted into the woods, my heart pounding in my chest. Branches and leaves tore at my clothes and skin. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. The hum of the Buick's engine seemed to follow me, even among the trees. With every step I took, it felt as though something invisible was right behind me. I tripped and fell to the ground, gasping for air. I glanced back. There was nothing there. But then, a cold whisper tickled my ear. "You'll never escape." I opened my eyes. I was back in my car, parked in the exact spot where the road had split. The engine was off, and the Buick was gone. My phone buzzed again on the seat, a final message popping up. "See you soon." I stared at the empty road ahead, my mind consumed by one horrifying thought: this isn't over. The following days blurred into a haze of paranoia. I left my car in an abandoned lot on the outskirts of the city, unable to bear the thought of driving again. Now, everything felt like a threat, shadows lurking in corners, reflections in windows, even the silence. My phone kept sending messages, even though I had turned it off. I used to take the battery out of my phone. Sometimes, while I was sleeping, I could hear it vibrating, as if the messages were filtering directly into my dreams. Every single one said the same thing: "See you soon." One night, as I was trying to rest on the motel sofa, something changed. I woke up at 3:17 a.m., my heart pounding in my chest for no apparent reason. The room was completely dark, except for the faint light from a street lamp seeping through the curtains. Everything was silent, too silent. Then I heard it. A soft knock, like a finger tapping against the door. Knock, knock, knock. I froze. The sound seemed to echo inside my skull. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. No answer. I slowly moved towards the door, each step making me feel like I was walking towards my own doom. I looked through the peephole, expecting to see emptiness. Instead, I saw it. The Buick parked just outside the motel entrance, its windows fogged up as usual. The driver's side door was open, and a familiar figure stood next to it, staring at me. It was my reflection. Again. But it looked more worn, darker. Its hollow eyes gleamed in the light from the street lamp. It knocked again, this time harder. Knock, knock, knock. I stumbled back, my breathing growing more erratic. "Leave me alone!" I shouted. The knocking stopped, but then a whisper came from the other side of the door, low and icy. "I'm always inside." I spun around, searching for something, anything to protect myself. But when I looked back, the motel door was wide open. The Buick and the figure had disappeared. The air inside the room had turned freezing. The lights flickered and then went out, leaving me in complete darkness. Then I felt it. A cold breath on my neck. "What do you think you can run?" I woke up at dawn, lying on the floor. The door was shut and locked. But the words, "You can't escape," were written in something dark on the bathroom mirror. I know I can't keep running. No matter where I go, the Buick always finds me. The figure is always behind me, waiting, lurking. Every time I close my eyes, I see it. And I know that eventually, when I'm too tired to fight, it will take my place. I decided to do something I'd never considered before. I couldn't keep running anymore. Every step I took seemed to lead me back to the same place, to the same moment. If it wanted something from me, it would find out that night. At 3:17 a.m. I waited. I sat in the middle of the motel room with the lights off, holding only a knife in one hand and my phone, which I hadn't touched since the last time it vibrated. The window was slightly open, letting in the cold morning air like a warning. The first sound was the engine, the low growl of the Buick's motor, rumbling outside the motel. I didn't look out the window. I didn't need to. I knew it was there, waiting for me. Then the knocks. Knock, knock, knock. I didn't move. "Come in," I said, my voice trembling but firm. For a moment, silence took over the room, as if the world was holding its breath. Then, the motel doors slowly creaked open with a long, painful squeak. The figure entered, hunched over. And silent, her face still hidden in the shadows, she closed the door behind her, stepping forward toward me. Each step echoed on the wooden floor. "Why are you running?" she asked, her voice grotesque, far from my own. "I'm not running," I replied, raising the knife. "Tell me what you want." She stopped a meter away from me, tilting her head as if she was pondering my question. Her eyes, two dark pits, glowed with something that looked like satisfaction. "What do I want?" she repeated, her smile widening. "I want what belongs to me. You don't have anything here," I said, though deep inside, I knew I was wrong. She stretched out a long, pale hand toward me. Her fingers were bony, too long, with sharp nails that scraped the air. "Your life," she said simply. My throat closed up. I knew she wasn't speaking figuratively. I felt the air around me thicken, as if every breath I took was heavier than the last. But I didn't stop. I lunged toward her, the knife aimed at her chest. The movement was useless. Before I could even get close, her hand caught mine with an icy grip, and the knife fell to the floor with a metallic clang. "Always so predictable," she said, stepping even closer. I felt trapped, powerless. But then I remembered something: the phone. With my free hand, I pulled it out of my pocket and switched it on. The screen lit up her face completely for the first time. It was my face, but distorted. The skin was pale and taut, the eyes completely black, and the smile stretched far too wide, as if someone had pulled the muscles beyond what was possible. I pressed the camera button and snapped a picture. The figure screamed, a sound that was inhuman, filling the entire room. She let go of my hand, and her form began to twist and crumble, disintegrating like smoke under the light of the screen. "You can't stop me," she hissed, her voice breaking apart. The room was still. I didn't know what I had faced that night, but I've never seen it again. Still, I know this isn't over. Sometimes, when I pass a mirror, I notice something strange in my reflection. A smile too wide, a flash of darkness in my eyes. And every night, at exactly 3:17 a.m., my phone vibrates with a message. "I'll come back for what belongs to me." Since that night in the motel, I've tried to regain some sense of normalcy in my life, even though I know it's an impossible task. I moved to a different city, changed my phone number, and even quit my job. But things never went back to the way they were. Sometimes, when I'm home alone, the hum of my phone returns, even when it's turned off and has no battery. Always at 3:17 a.m. I don't dare open the messages. The feeling of being watched never fully leaves me. It's more subtle now, like a shadow at the edge of my vision or a chill that runs down my spine when I'm in an empty place. But the worst part is the reflection. Mirrors are no longer a refuge of peace. Every time I look at myself, I expect to see that twisted smile or those black eyes. So far, everything seems normal. But the fear never lets go. 3 nights ago, something happened that made me write this. I woke up at 3:17 a.m., just like always. There were no buzzing sounds, no knocks at the door, just silence. I decided to get up and check the locks. I decided to walk a bit to calm myself down. As I passed by the bathroom mirror, something made me stop. My reflection was there, exactly as it should be, but as I moved away, I saw it shift. I know it froze at first, with that unnervingly wide smile that wasn't mine. Then, it raised a hand and waved at me. Ever since that night, I've covered all the mirrors in my apartment. I live with the lights on and barely sleep, but I know it doesn't matter what I do, the thing always comes back. The reflection is always waiting, and eventually, I too will disappear. I first noticed it when I was filling up at a gas station off the highway exit. It was around 11:30 p.m., and I was coming back from a meeting in Portland. The gas station coffee and peanut butter cookies were the only things keeping me awake during the drive. The station was old, one of those places with manual pumps and a flickering neon sign. The only sound was the hum of the pump and the occasional chirp of a cricket in the darkness. As the pump slowly filled the tank, My eyes caught sight of an old Buick, a model from the 70s, parked across the lot. It was dark, maybe navy blue or black. The windows were completely fogged from the inside, as if someone had been breathing there for hours. I tried to convince myself that someone was just sleeping in the car, maybe a trucker taking a break, but something about it felt off. I filled the tank, put the nozzle back, and walked into the store to pay. Inside, the clerk seemed bored, absorbed in his phone. I bought another coffee, even though I didn't need it, just to give myself an excuse to delay and glance at the Buick once more. As I stepped outside, something caught my attention. A tall figure was standing behind the station, barely visible in the shadows of the building. It was hard to make out any details, but it seemed to be staring in my direction, motionless, like a statue. My heart raced, and I quickened my pace. I climbed into my car, slammed the doors shut, turned the engine on, and drove out of the parking lot faster than I should have. The first few minutes on the road were calm. My headlights illuminated the empty highway flanked by dark trees. I kept checking the mirrors, but saw nothing. Then, the old, yellowish headlights appeared. They were distant at first, but their shape felt familiar, the Buick. My grip on the steering wheel tightened. It must have been a coincidence, I told myself. It was probably just going in the same direction. But every time I sped up, the headlights seemed to match my speed. When I slowed down, they did too. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the road, but I couldn't stop glancing at the rearview mirror. The headlights were always there, unchanging. The Buick switched on its high beams, flooding my car with harsh white light. My car swerved as I instinctively jerked the steering wheel, almost veering off the road. Fear began to replace logic. The Buick kept its distance, always behind me, as if it were playing a game. I tried to calm myself down, but my breathing was shallow and quick. My hands were sweating on the steering wheel as the road curved ahead. I took the turn a bit faster than I should have, the tires of my car screeching as my body leaned with the inertia. The Buick did the same, maneuvering effortlessly as if it were mimicking every move I made. I tried to remind myself that I was alone on a deserted road, that it was probably just an annoyed driver or a prankster, but something didn't add up. I passed a sign that said, "Next service is 47 miles. My gas gauge was already close to a quarter tank. I'll make it, I thought, though I knew at the speed I was going, my fuel wouldn't last long. The Buick drew closer now. I could see the details of its hood in my mirror, but there was something else, stains on the windows. No, they weren't stains. They were handprints pressed from the inside of the glass, fogged up as if someone was trapped inside, desperate to get out. My eyes snapped back to the road just in time to avoid drifting out of my lane. I stomped on the gas pedal, the Honda responding with a growl, speeding up from 0 to 60. The Buick was still there, mimicking every move, never getting closer, but never backing off either. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. I reached out a trembling hand from the wheel and quickly checked it. Unknown number. I let it ring. Then, a message popped up. "Why are you in such a hurry?" A chill ran down my spine. I dropped the phone onto the seat and turned my focus back to the road. Another message came through. "We're catching up to you." I checked my mirrors again. The Buick's headlights were still there, unmoving. 10 more minutes passed. My nerves were shredded, and every engine sound, every shadow on the road made me jump. Then I saw a sign. "Rest area next exit." And something else. An unmistakable police car parked under the lights, blue lights flashing against the nearby trees. Instant relief washed over me. I sharply turned into the exit, letting the tires crunch on the gravel as I came to a stop near the patrol car. I barely turned off the engine when I stumbled out of the car. The officer stepped out of his vehicle, looking confused as I approached, stammering. "Is everything okay?" he asked, glancing over my shoulder toward the road. "Someone's following me," I said, pointing toward the Buick. but when I turned to look back at the road, it was empty. There were no yellowish headlights, no old Buick. It was just gone. It was right there, I murmured, suddenly feeling ridiculous. The officer frowned. Why don't you get back in your car? I'll follow you for a few miles to make sure everything's all right. I nodded, still shaking, and made my way back to my car. I locked the doors and turned the engine back on. The Honda purred weakly, a sound that used to comfort me, but now it barely calmed my nerves. The officer signaled for me to follow, and we both headed back onto the road. His blue lights flashed in the distance, a beacon of safety that helped keep my nerves in check. For the first few minutes, everything seemed normal. My hands gripped the wheel tight. The mist swirled between the mirrors and the road. Suddenly, the phone on the passenger seat vibrated again. A message appeared on the screen. Do you think he can help you? My stomach dropped. I ignored the phone, focusing instead on the police car's headlights in front of me. But the vibrations kept coming, one after another, filling the car with a constant buzzing sound. I couldn't escape it. On the next curve, I glanced at the phone. There was another notification. We're closer than you think. My breath caught in my throat, becoming shallow and erratic. I looked in the rearview mirror. The yellow headlights of the Buick were there again, impossibly close, right behind me, as if they had never left. The officer in front didn't seem to notice anything. I slammed my hand down on the horn, desperate to get his attention. Stop! I screamed, but he couldn't hear me. I stomped on the gas pedal, trying to outpace him. But in the mirror, the Buick accelerated too, closing the gap between us. Then, the patrol car's lights began to flicker and fade. No, it wasn't a problem with the lights. The car itself seemed to dissolve into the darkness, as if it had never been there. No, I murmured, my throat tightening with panic. I jerked the wheel toward the shoulder and slammed on the brakes. The Buick stopped too. The air inside the car felt thick, like I was suffocating, gasping for oxygen. I looked in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the Buick's headlights. But they were gone. I turned my gaze forward, and there it was, parked right in the middle of the road, closer than ever. The windows were still fogged up, and handprints covered the glass. But now they were moving, as if something, or someone, was trying to escape from inside. My phone vibrated again. Trembling, I picked it up. There's no way out. The Buick's lights flickered once, then went out, plunging the road into darkness. The engine of my car roared to life as I slammed the accelerator, racing away from there. I tore down the road at a breakneck speed, praying for any sign of life, a town, anything that could pull me out of this nightmare. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. The road remained empty, and the trees seemed to close in around me. My gas gauge was dangerously close to empty. Finally, I saw a green sign, next exit, 24-hour diner, 1 mile. For the first time in hours, a flicker of hope surged inside me. I took the turn, and at the end of the road, I saw the glowing lights of the diner illuminating a small gravel parking lot. 3 cars were parked there, a truck, a van, and a black sedan that froze my blood as soon as I saw it. It was the Buick. I slammed on the brakes, stopping just short of the parking lot, the engine still running. My phone buzzed one last time. It's time to try the pie. The message felt like a punch to my chest. My hands gripped the steering wheel, shaking, as I stared at the Buick parked in front of the diner. The yellowish light from the 24-hour sign cast an eerie glow on the car, highlighting the fogged windows and the handprints, which now seemed to pulse with life. Don't go in, I told myself. But I knew I had no choice. The gas tank was almost empty. My only option was to go inside the diner, make a call, and somehow find a way out of this nightmare. I turned off the engine and opened the door slowly, as if any sudden movement could trigger something worse. The air was cold, carrying a strange metallic scent I couldn't place. As I stepped into the diner, the bell above the door rang out too loudly for my frayed nerves. The place was empty, except for a waitress behind the counter. She had her hair pulled into a messy bun, and her eyes, something about them made me freeze in place. With a tired expression, her name tag read Linda. "What can I get you?" she asked, her eyes never leaving the coffee she was pouring. "Just gas and a coffee," I murmured, trying to sound calm. Linda nodded and placed the coffee pot down, reaching into a drawer behind the counter to pull out a key. "The pumps are outside. You'll need this key to turn them on," she said, setting it down on the counter. I reached out to grab the key, but something made me hesitate. The reflection in the metal of the key wasn't mine. It was his face, the man in the suit, with his black eyes and that impossible smile. I immediately withdrew my hand, my breath quickening. "Are you okay?" Linda asked, leaning forward. Her voice sounded genuine, but the room suddenly felt colder. I looked around, trying to ignore the chill creeping down my spine. The diner was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of a clock marking the passing hours. Suddenly, the bell above the door jingled again. I spun around quickly. The man in the suit was standing there, his dark attire, wide grin, and completely black eyes locking onto mine. "I knew you'd come," he said, his voice smooth but firm. Linda didn't seem to notice anything odd. "Can I get you something, sweetie?" she asked him. "Oh no," he replied, his gaze still fixed on me. "I'm just here to make sure he tries the pie." The waitress nodded as if there was nothing strange in his words and disappeared into the kitchen. The man walked towards me slowly, each step echoing like thunder in my ears. "All this time running away," he said as he sat down across from me. "Aren't you tired?" My words caught in my throat. "What do you want?" I managed to whisper. His smile widened even further. "Just for you to understand," he said. "You can't escape. This road, this diner, this moment, if we end it here, it's fate." Linda returned with a plate of peach pie. "Here you go," she said, placing it in front of me. I looked at the pie. It looked perfect, too perfect. The peaches glistened as if they'd been lacquered, and the smell was sweet, almost intoxicating. "Eat," the man urged. "I don't want to," I replied, pulling away from the plate. His black eyes gleamed with a dangerous intensity. "Eat," he repeated, his tone much more forceful. My heart was pounding in my chest. With trembling hands I took the fork and cut a small piece of the pie. The first bite was as sweet as I'd expected, but then something metallic filled my mouth, a cold, cruel taste. My vision began to blur. The man smiled, pleased. "I told you," he whispered as everything around me started to fade away. The sky above the old Henderson farm was a leaden gray when I decided to return. I had no other choice. My savings had run out faster than I'd anticipated after fleeing, and the city, with its constant noise and lights, no longer offered the sense of security I once thought it had. I had heard about interested buyers for the property, but no one had closed the deal. The land still waited, as if calling me back. Finally, one night, driven by desperation and the overwhelming need to escape, I made my way back. And perhaps it was something deeper, something I didn't want to admit to myself. I unpacked and made my way to the place where it all began. The dirt road leading up to the farm was narrower than I remembered, the weeds slowly reclaiming the land. The rusty silo stood against the sky, and the house looked older, more tired, as if time had sped up in my absence. The "for sale" sign was still there, hanging from a crooked post. I parked the car and sat, staring at the house through the vehicle's window. The feeling of being watched hit me instantly, a heavy, familiar weight that gripped my chest. I forced myself out of the car, my boots crunching on the damp ground as I drew closer to the house. That's when I noticed something had changed. The windows were boarded up, but one of the planks on the upper floor had been ripped off. There were marks on the window frame, as if something with claws had torn it apart. When I opened the door, the air inside was thick, heavy. It wasn't just dust or moisture, there was something else, something almost tangible. Everything was as I had left it. The furniture covered in sheets, the dining table with a fine layer of dust, and the old clock on the wall, frozen at 3:17 a.m. That time. That hour. I started unpacking, trying to convince myself that this time, things would be different. I tried to rationalize it. This was just an old house. Everything that had happened before was in my head, a product of loneliness and isolation. But the nights, they were the same. No, they were worse. The first night I slept in the house, the footsteps started again. Heavy, slow, crossing the floor upstairs. I didn't go up to investigate. I just lay there, the rifle gripped tightly in my hands, staring at the closed door to my bedroom. On the second night, I found the footprints in the mud outside. This time, they were bigger, deeper, like something heavier than any human or animal I knew had been there, walking around the house. The third night, I was jolted awake by a loud knock on the front door. Knock, knock, knock. My heart was pounding in my chest like a drum. I got up, grabbed the flashlight, and crept closer to the door. There was no one there. But on the ground, I found another note. This one wasn't written on paper like before. No, it was carved into the wood of the door. You can't escape. Panic surged through me, but this time, I didn't run. I didn't pack up my things and leave. Instead, I went down to the basement. The basement had always been the part of the house I avoided the most. The wooden stairs creaked under my weight, as if they might collapse any second. The air down there was damp, musty, no surprise there. But something else lingered in the atmosphere, something old, something rotten. Yet something told me if I wanted answers, if I wanted to understand what was chasing me, I had to start there. The flashlight beam illuminated the bare stone walls, covered in years of dirt and cobwebs. Everything seemed normal, except for one corner. The stones in that area were darker, almost as if they had been burned. And on the ground in front of that corner, someone had drawn symbols, faded dark marks that were still visible. The central symbol was a circle, surrounded by twisted lines that seemed to represent human figures, all facing inward. And in the center of the circle, something was buried. I began to dig, my hands pulling at the damp earth. Finally, my fingers brushed against something hard and cold. It was a metal box, sealed shut with a rusty padlock. Without wasting a moment, I rushed up the stairs, clutching the box in my arms, and placed it on the dining table. I grabbed a crowbar to break open the lock, my heart racing with anticipation. Inside, I found three things: an old, worn-out diary with its cover barely holding together, a strange knife with a carved bone handle, and a small jar filled with what appeared to be ashes. I opened the diary, the pages filled with irregular handwriting, words scratched out, and phrases that seemed to ramble on endlessly. But one passage stood out, a warning that made my blood run cold. The sacrifice must remain sealed. If you release it, it will never stop. It will move from body to body, from place to place, always searching, always hungry. That night, the footsteps didn't stop. For the first time, they weren't just upstairs. They were everywhere, on the ceiling, the walls. Something was awake. Something I couldn't ignore. Knife in one hand and the jar in the other, I made my way back down to the basement. With each step, the house seemed to vibrate beneath me, as if something deep within its bones had stirred, eager to be freed. The footsteps echoed around me, louder, faster, more insistent. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, the air was thick, suffocating. A chill that sank into my very bones, yet I was sweating as if I were in the middle of summer. The burned corner of the wall appeared darker now, and the marks on the floor were clearer. The human figures surrounding the circle seemed to move, shifting beneath the flickering light of my flashlight. I knew it was impossible, or at least, I wanted to believe it was. I opened the jar with the ashes, repeating the words from the diary. The sacrifice must remain sealed. I had to return whatever had been buried here, seal it away forever. Pouring the ashes into the circle, a cold wind rushed through the basement, impossible in such a closed space. The light from my flashlight flickered and then I heard it. A whisper, at first just a faint sound. "You can't stop us." Then came laughter, not from a single voice, but many voices intertwined, echoing inside my head. I dropped the empty jar and grabbed the knife, stepping backward toward the stairs. The walls began to tremble, and the floor groaned under my feet. The circle on the floor started to glow with a reddish light, and from the burned corner, a figure emerged. It was tall, too tall, its limbs long and twisted. Its face was a mass of shadows, but in the center, there were eyes. Too many eyes, all staring at me, blinking in unison. "We warned you to leave," the voice boomed. But it didn't come from its mouth. It came from everywhere, vibrating in my chest, ringing in my ears. Without thinking, I raised the knife and hurled it at the figure. The blade spun through the air, but it never hit its mark. The figure simply dissolved into black smoke, swirling around the circle before shooting toward me. The smoke enveloped me, cold and suffocating, at the same time. I felt something invade my head, my chest, my very soul. I collapsed to my knees, screaming as the world around me faded to darkness. I woke up at dawn, lying on the basement floor. My flashlight was off, but the weak light of the sun filtered through a crack in the ceiling. Everything was silent. The circle was gone, and the burned corner of the wall was untouched, as if it had never been disturbed. The knife and the jar, they were gone too. The jar was lying next to me, but the diary had disintegrated into ashes. I stood up, wobbling on unsteady legs, my heart pounding as I tried to gather my bearings. Stepping out onto the porch, I noticed the sign for the farm. Henderson's, tossed haphazardly on the ground. The paint on the letters looked fresh, as if it had been repainted just the night before. When I opened the door of my car, there was a note on the driver's seat. It read, "We warned you." I didn't hesitate. I left the farm that very day. Don't pack anything, not until the house disappears over the horizon. That was the last thing I saw before leaving, as the morning sun started to rise. Now I'm holed up in a motel, trying to understand what happened, trying to forget. But deep down, I know I'm not alone. The wind whispers things in the night, things I don't want to hear. Every time I close my eyes, I see those eyes, too many eyes blinking, waiting. I don't know if they were sealed up like the diary said, or if they just let me go for now. But something tells me I haven't finished with them. And something tells me they haven't finished with me. It's been 3 days since I left Henderson's farm, and each one has been worse than the last. No matter how far I drive or how safe the motel room feels, I can feel their presence. It's as if the air is heavier, like the shadows stretch a little longer than they should. On the 3rd day, while I was at a gas station in a small town, I noticed something odd. The cashier, an older man with a scruffy beard, stared at me while I paid. "You were at Henderson's farm," he said, his voice low and filled with an eerie knowledge. The air seemed to stick in my throat. "What do you know about that farm?" I asked, trying to sound nonchalant, but my voice trembled. The man leaned in, his gray eyes gleaming with something I couldn't quite place. "Nothing good comes from that place. You shouldn't have gone into the basement." I froze. "How do you know that?" I stammered, my heart racing. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was more like a mixture of compassion and pity. "You're not the first one to run out of there like that. People always think they can face them. But they don't leave you. You leave with them." I wanted to ask more, to demand answers, but something in his tone stopped me. I took my change quickly and left, feeling his eyes boring into my back until I reached the car. That night, things escalated at the motel. I was lying on the bed, the knife from the Henderson basement by my side. I haven't had the courage to put it down since I found it. It was 3:01 a.m. when it started. First, the wind, a low, howling sound that seemed to come from everywhere, even though the windows were shut tight. Then came the footsteps, louder this time, thundering in the hallway right outside my door. I sat up, gripping the knife with a trembling hand. The motel door began to shake, as if someone was softly but persistently knocking on it. Knock, knock, knock. "Leave me alone!" I screamed, though I knew it wouldn't help. The knocking stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. My heart pounded so hard in my chest I thought it might burst. Then, the voice came, a deep, chilling whisper. "You belong to us." It wasn't just a whisper. It was a chorus, dozens, maybe hundreds, of voices speaking in unison, filling the room like a roar. The lamp exploded, plunging the room into total darkness. The only light came from a crack in the door. Through that crack I saw them, eyes. Dozens of them, watching me from the darkness of the hallway. That's when it clicked. I'll never escape. I'm writing this from my car now. I'm parked on the outskirts of town, too terrified to stay in the motel, but with nowhere else to go. Henderson's farm was just the beginning. What I unleashed in that basement can't be sealed away again. I don't know how much time I have left, but I'm sure of one thing. If anyone finds this, listen to my warning, don't go to Henderson's farm. And if you ever see eyes in the darkness, don't look for too long. The first time I heard about the marble door, I thought it was just an urban legend, one of those eerie stories told in hushed tones to frighten the curious. According to the rumors, it was hidden away in the basement of an abandoned building to the east of the city, in a factory that had shut down decades ago after a mysterious fire. The door itself was tall, almost flawless in its construction, a block of polished white marble that stood in stark contrast to the decay of the building. There was no visible handle, lock, or hinges, but those brave enough to approach it claimed to feel something, an invisible pull, a presence, and then, a whisper, "Open it." Of course, the rules were clear: never touch the door. Never respond to the whisper. And under no circumstances, never try to open it. I didn't believe in those kinds of stories, but my friend Lucas did. He had always been the curious type, the one who pushed boundaries. So when he disappeared after talking about investigating the door, I knew I had to go after him. I arrived just after dusk. The facade of the building was covered in graffiti, its windows shattered, and the air smelled of rusted metal and something else, a sickly sweet stench that made my stomach turn. I pushed open the heavy front door, which creaked loudly in protest. The interior was in ruins, debris scattered everywhere, broken furniture, and an echo that made each step feel like a punch to the chest. Lucas had sent me his last known location in a message before he vanished: the southern room in the basement. I descended the concrete stairs, my flashlight cutting through the dust hanging thick in the air. The basement was bigger than I expected, with endless hallways twisting off in all directions. Then, at the end of a narrow corridor, I saw it. It was framed by walls of brick covered in mold. The marble door. It was both beautiful and terrifying at the same time. The surface was so smooth it reflected the light from my flashlight, but as I got closer, I felt something unusual. A pressure in my chest, as if the air itself was resisting my presence. And then I heard it. "Open it." The voice didn't come from anywhere specific. It wasn't male or female. It just was. "Lucas, are you here?" I called out, my voice echoing down the hall. Silence. I looked around, hoping to spot some sign of my friend. I found a backpack lying against the wall. It was his. Inside, there was a notebook, a lighter, and a broken flashlight. I pulled out the notebook and began to read his frantic notes. "The door is calling me. I feel something behind it. Something important. I have to open it. There's no other option." My stomach turned. There were more scribbled notes, almost illegible, scrawled in a desperate hand. "It's not what it seems. It's not a door. They want to come out. Don't open the door." The words repeated again and again on the last pages. "Don't open the door. Don't open the door." The pull toward the marble door grew stronger as I moved closer. It seemed to vibrate slightly, even though the air around it remained still. I felt a presence behind me. I spun around quickly, but there was no one there. Then the voice came again, louder this time. "Open it. You need to." My hand trembled as I touched the marble surface. It was cold, far colder than it should have been. Something inside me screamed for me to stop, but another part of me, a darker part, was intrigued. I closed my eyes and pushed. The world shifted. The corridor vanished, and I found myself standing in a dark field beneath a sky void of stars. Everything around me was shrouded in a dense fog that seemed to move with a life of its own. The ground beneath my feet was soft and damp, and in the distance, I could make out distorted humanoid shapes shifting through the mist. "Lucas!" I shouted, but my voice was swallowed by the fog. One of the shadows stopped and turned toward me. Though it had no face, I felt its gaze pierce through me. "He's here!" a voice echoed inside my head. I moved closer, each step sinking deeper into the soft, muddy ground. When I was near enough, I saw that the shadow wasn't a person at all. It was something else entirely. Tall, thin, with limbs that stretched and contracted with every movement, it held something in its hands. Lucas' backpack. "Where is he?" I demanded, though my voice sounded weak, even to my own ears. The shadow extended an arm, pointing toward the distance. That's when I saw him. Lucas was kneeling on the ground, hunched as if praying. I approached him, but when my hand touched his shoulder, he crumbled into black ashes that scattered in the wind. The shadows began to close in, their movements erratic, unnatural. The voice came back, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a roar that shook the very ground beneath my feet. "Come back, bring more!" I woke up, lying on the basement floor, in front of the marble door. My flashlight was off, but the moonlight filtered through a crack in the wall. The door was closed, pristine, as if nothing had ever happened. I shakily got to my feet, Lucas' backpack still in my hands, and stumbled out of the building without looking back. I never spoke of what I saw, but I knew that the door was still there, waiting. And I knew that one day, I'd hear its voice again. "Open it!" For weeks after my experience with the marble door, I tried to convince myself it had all been a hallucination. Maybe exhaustion and desperation to find Lucas had clouded my judgment. But every night, when I closed my eyes, I saw that dark field, the shadows moving through the mist, and I heard the voice. "Come back, bring more!" I couldn't ignore it, but I couldn't understand it either. What did bring more mean? Why was it calling to me? Lucas' backpack stayed in my apartment, a constant reminder of what had happened. I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it. One night, as I was trying to sleep, I heard a faint sound coming from the living room. It was soft, like the rustling of fabric. I got out of bed, feeling the cold floor beneath my feet. In the living room, I found Lucas' backpack open. I hadn't touched it since I returned. On the floor next to it was a folded piece of paper. I didn't remember it being part of Lucas' things. My hands trembled as I picked it up and unfolded it. It was a drawing in black ink, the marble door. Surrounding it were human-like figures, shadows kneeling before the door. Beneath the drawing, a phrase was written. "Each sacrifice strengthens the bond." I knew I couldn't ignore this anymore. Whatever was behind that door wouldn't stop. And if Lucas was trapped, maybe there was a way to free him. That very night, I returned to the abandoned building. The air felt heavier than the first time I had been there. Every step I took toward the basement felt harder, as if something was trying to stop me. When I reached the hallway where the door was, I noticed something different. The brick walls were covered in marks, scratches that hadn't been there before. On the floor, in front of the marble door, there was a pile of black ashes. I kneeled before them, hoping they wouldn't be what I feared, but as soon as I touched them, an icy sensation rushed through my body. These were the same ashes where Lucas had crumbled in that other place. The shadows weren't just behind the door anymore, now they were here. The voice greeted me before I even touched the surface. "You've returned," it said. My throat closed up. "Choose," it demanded. I asked, even though I already knew the answer. "Choose what?" "One enters. One remains." The door vibrated as though it were responding to the voice. I understood what it meant. If I wanted to free Lucas, someone would have to take his place, a sacrifice. My legs trembled as I drew closer. I placed my hands on the cold marble, and the pressure in my chest intensified. "And if I don't choose?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The voice roared, shaking the basement, causing the dust to fall from the cracks in the ceiling. "Then I'll fall," it bellowed. I don't know how long I stood there, battling with the decision. I could see the image clearly in my mind, the figures kneeling before the door, and I understood what they meant. It wasn't just Lucas. There were others before him. People after me. All trapped by curiosity. All drawn by the same empty promise, bring more. That was the cycle. Someone enters. Someone stays. To keep choosing. To continue the sacrifice. I took a step back, away from the door. "They'll come for you," I muttered. The door lit up briefly, like a silent lightning bolt, before turning completely opaque. The pressure in the air lifted, but a hollow feeling settled deep inside me. I ran from the basement, leaving Lucas's backpack behind. I knew I wouldn't be back. Months later, I tried to restart my life. I moved to another state, took a job that didn't require night shifts, and avoided any place that even remotely resembled that building. But the voice never left. Sometimes, in my dreams, I see the marble door again. Sometimes, as I walk down busy streets, I feel the presence of shadows behind me, moving just out of sight. And I always hear those words. "They'll come for you." I can't escape it. One day, someone else will find the door. Someone else will be called. And when that happens, I just hope they're stronger than I was. Because this cycle, it has no end. The fluorescent sign of Jerry's diner flickered against the darkness of Highway 43. I needed coffee. My eyes ached after 12 straight hours of driving, and the cheap energy drinks were no longer cutting it. I parked my Honda Civic in the gravel lot, the headlights illuminating 3 other vehicles, a cargo truck, an old Chevy truck, and a black sedan I couldn't make out in the dark. The bell above the door jingled as I entered. The smell of burnt coffee and grease hit me immediately. A tired-looking waitress was cleaning the counter, and an elderly man hunched over a newspaper in a booth in the corner. Behind the kitchen window, I could hear the sizzle of something on the grill and the clinking of plates. I sank into a red vinyl stool at the counter, my joints stiff from being seated too long. The waitress, whose name tag read Linda, came over with a coffee pot. "Tough night?" she asked, already pouring without waiting for my reply. "Long trip," I replied, wrapping my hands around the hot cup. "I still have about 4 more hours to go." The bell jingled again. I didn't turn around, focused on adding sugar to my coffee. But I felt someone sit 2 stools down. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed it was a man in a dark jacket. "Hey," he said, his voice strangely upbeat for 1 in the morning. "You heading north on 43? I glanced at him briefly, noting his clean-shaven face. Her perfectly styled hair seemed too immaculate for this hour, as if she had just walked out of an office instead of coming from a long journey. "Yes," I replied, focusing back on my coffee. "You must have left Nashville around noon, right? That stretch under construction on I-24 was brutal today." My hand froze halfway to my mouth. She hadn't mentioned Nashville or I-24. The traffic jam near exit 47 had been endless. She continued, still cheerful. Good thing you found that UTA alternative through the suburbs, though. Saved you at least an hour. I slowly placed my cup back on the counter. I had taken a detour through the suburbs to avoid the traffic. The ceramic made a soft click as it hit the surface. I know you, I asked finally. She turned to look at me. No, but I saw you at the Shell gas station in Lebanon. You bought that chicken sandwich for lunch, the one with pickles. My stomach tightened. I had stopped at a Shell in Lebanon 6 hours ago, and yes, I had bought a chicken sandwich with pickles. You've got a good memory, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Oh, I noticed the details, she replied, tapping her fingers on the counter. Her fingers were long and pale. Like when you called your wife at the rest stop near Bowling Green, the one with the broken vending machine. You told her you'd be home by morning. My heart began to pound. I hadn't seen anyone following me. I had been checking my mirrors regularly, a habit from when I used to drive late in dangerous neighborhoods. Look, I don't know what game you're playing, I began to say. And that gas station in Portland with the flickering lights? She interrupted, still laughing. The clerk was asleep. You had to knock 3 times to wake him. You bought a Red Bull and those peanut butter cookies. The orange package, not the yellow one. I stood up so quickly that the stool screeched against the floor. Linda looked up from the cash register, but the man waved her off with a reassuring gesture. Just catching up with an old friend, she said, going back to counting bills. I'm leaving, I said, pulling a $10 bill from my wallet and laying it on the counter. My hands were shaking. Drive safely, she said. It's dark out there. There are a lot of deer on that stretch. Would be a shame if something happened before you got home. I walked toward the door as quickly as I could without running. The bell above the door jingled, but not too loudly. The cold air slapped me like a punch as I stepped outside. My car was where I had left it, but somehow it looked different under the dim lights of the most isolated part of the lot. My clumsy fingers dropped the keys once before I managed to unlock the door. Inside, I locked all the doors and started the engine. The dashboard clock read 1:17 a.m. My hands were sweating on the wheel. I glanced toward the diner windows. The man was standing by the counter, staring at my car. He raised his hand in a friendly wave, then smiled again, wider this time. Even through the glass in the distance, I could see his eyes clearly. They were completely black. Not just the irises, everything visible in both eyes was as dark as oil. I slammed my foot on the gas, shifting into reverse. The tires kicked up gravel as I turned toward the highway. The car swayed slightly, but I kept my foot firmly on the gas. In the rearview mirror, I could still see him standing by the diner window, waving. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. The speedometer shot up to 80, then 90. I didn't care about speeding tickets. I just needed distance. After 10 minutes of driving, my phone began to vibrate on the passenger seat. Unknown number. I let it ring. A text notification appeared on the screen. Against my better judgment, I stole a quick glance at the next curve. You forgot your receipt. You really should have tried the cake. Linda makes it fresh every day. I threw my phone into the back seat. My hands were shaking, and I had to slow down to maintain control of the car. Another message came in. I heard the buzz, then another and another. Each vibration made me jump. The messages kept coming, one after the other, as if someone was typing furiously. The next curve revealed a rest area ahead. I slammed on the brakes and turned into the entrance, tires screeching. I needed to turn off my phone, maybe even call the police, but I wasn't sure what I'd tell them. As I leaned toward the back seat to grab my phone, the headlights of a car illuminated my vehicle. A black sedan had stopped right next to me. I didn't wait to see who was getting out. I put the car in drive and sped out of the rest area, heart pounding in my throat. The sedan's headlights appeared in my rearview mirror within seconds. The road stretched empty in front of me, a dark ribbon under my headlights. The sedan stayed exactly 3 car lengths behind me, matching my speed no matter if I accelerated or slowed down. The gas gauge showed half a tank. I could keep driving for hours without stopping, but eventually I'd need fuel. The thought made my stomach churn. A green sign popped up, next services 30 miles. The sedan's headlights stayed firm in my mirror, neither getting closer nor farther, just there. Then my phone vibrated again in the back seat. This time, the sound was different, a pattern, 3 short vibrations, 3 long ones, 3 short ones again and again. It was Morse code. The radio turned on by itself, filled with static at first, then a voice came through the white noise. "The cake was excellent today, Peach, your favorite." I jerked the wheel, almost colliding with the semi I was passing. The truck's horn blared as I regained my lane. "You should have tried it at least," the voice continued clearly, despite the static. "Linda's going to be so disappointed." I hit the power button on the radio. Nothing happened. I pressed harder. "It's rude to ignore people," said the voice. "Especially when they're just trying to be friendly." I ripped the volume knob off in desperation, but the voice didn't lower in volume. "Like that nice lady at the Shell station, the one who helped you find the chicken sandwiches. You didn't even thank her properly." My hands were numb on the wheel. The sedan's headlights remained steady, shadowing me like a predator. "You just hit and hit until she woke up," the voice continued. "What if you had asked how her night was?" I was breathing in quick gasps now, and my peripheral vision started to darken. "But now we can talk," the voice chirped. "We've got plenty of time. At least 4 hours." "No, that's what you told Linda." Another sign appeared, next services 42 miles. The voice hummed a tuneless melody for a few seconds. "You know something interesting about that gas station in Portland? The security cameras haven't worked in months. The owner always says he's going to fix them, but you know how it is with these things." My phone vibrated again, more notifications. Each buzz synced with the beat of my heart. "You know what that means?" the voice asked. "It's an SOS. It's funny, isn't it? People send it when they need help, but sometimes they send it when it's too late." The sedan was still there, unwavering, like a shadow. 17 curves left until the gas station," the voice said. "I can point out each one if you want. This next one is particularly tight. I suggest slowing down." I didn't slow down. The tires of my Honda screeched as I took the curve, the car swaying dangerously. "That was 1, the voice said. 16 left. Unless you want to stop earlier. There's a nice place up ahead. Very quiet. No cameras there either." The sedan's headlights turned with mine as we rounded the curve, maintaining that perfect distance. The gas gauge kept dropping. The warning light would come on soon, maybe in less than an hour if I kept driving at this speed. "You know," the voice continued, "an hour further there's another diner. They're open all night. They have better coffee than Jerry's, if you asked me." The voice on the phone emitted a sound of satisfaction, almost as if it were recalling something delicious. "You should try it. We could stop together." The phone's buzzing shifted rhythm, leaving behind the Morse code. Now, it pulsed in sync with my heartbeat. Every vibration reverberated in my chest, as though the phone were physically connected to my body. 2, the voice said, as we passed another curve. 15 more. You're driving really well, considering how tired you must be. All that driving, all those energy drinks, can't be good for you." I glanced at the speedometer. 95 miles per hour. The car trembled slightly at this speed. The steering wheel buzzed beneath my hands. 3, the voice counted, as I took the next turn. "You know, I'm starting to worry about you. Your heart's beating way too fast. And your hands must be cramping, gripping the wheel that tight. Why don't we stop for a moment? The headlights of the sedan stayed steady, 3 car lengths away, no matter what I did. 4. The voice continued. Did you know that 4 is considered unlucky in some cultures? Something about it sounding like the word for death. Interesting, right? Suddenly, my phone began playing a ringtone. It was a children's song, one I didn't recognize. The melody was slightly out of tune, distorted. 5. The voice counted. This next stretch of highway is my favorite. No streetlights for miles, just darkness and stars, and us, of course. The engine of the Ona began to groan, emitting a high-pitched whine I had never heard before. The steering wheel vibrated even more intensely. 6. The voice said. You're doing great, but you must be exhausted. All that adrenaline can't last forever. The fuel gauge was dangerously low. The warning light flickered on with a soft ding. 7. The voice continued. We're not even halfway through the curves. I mean, the gas station, well, that's a different story. Did I mention the pumps are broken? They should fix things faster around here. The children's song on my phone grew louder. The distortion increased, and I could almost make out the words in the lyrics. But I didn't want to understand them. 8. Said the voice. You know what's amazing about this stretch of road? No cell service. There's been no signal for the last 20 minutes. Didn't you notice that your wife's calls stopped coming through? I hadn't tried calling my wife. I hadn't tried calling anyone. 9. The voice continued. We're almost to the good part. There's a lovely view ahead. You can see the entire valley from there. Well, normally you can, but tonight it's pretty dark. The gas warning light flickered again. 10. Said the voice. You're running low on fuel, aren't you? Don't worry, I know a shortcut. The headlights of the sedan seemed closer now, even though I knew they weren't. They remained the exact same distance behind me. 11. The voice said. By the way, did you check your trunk before you left Nashville? You should always check. You never know what might be back there. My hands were so numb that I could no longer feel the steering wheel. 12. The voice counted. It's almost time to make a decision. The highway splits in 3 miles. The left fork leads to the gas station. The right, well, let's say it's a bit more private. The children's song on my phone reached a crescendo. Finally, the words became clear, ring around the rosy. 13. The voice said. The unlucky 13. You're not superstitious, are you? Of course not. A rational man like you doesn't believe in things that make noise in the night. The Ona's engine gave a warning screech, a high, desperate sound. 14. The voice continued. Can you feel it? The change in the air, just before something happens? Like the moment before a storm breaks. The fork in the road appeared in the distance. The signs were still too far to read. 15. The voice said. Time to decide. Left or right? Gas station or privacy? Finally, I could make out the signs. Gas food, left. Scenic route, right. 16. Said the voice. Just one more curve, then we'll see what kind of driver you really are. The fork was just a quarter mile away now. The sedan's headlights blazed in my rearview mirror. 17. The voice whispered. Last chance? What are you going to choose? I jerked the wheel to the left, tires screeching. The Ona swerved, almost sliding off the road. The sedan's headlights disappeared for a moment, and I thought it was over. Then my radio crackled to life. Bad choice, the voice said. The sedan's headlights reappeared, now directly in front of me, coming at me head-on down the highway. I screamed. I gripped the steering wheel with all my strength. The car veered off the road at 90 miles per hour. For an instant, there was a feeling of weightlessness, a sensation of falling that stretched on for what seemed like an eternity. Then came the impact. Everything shattered into fragments. When I opened my eyes, I was upside down, still strapped to my seat. Hot blood was running down my forehead. The engine of the car made a ticking sound as it cooled, and the air was filled with the smell of burning metal and gasoline. In the silence, I heard footsteps, the crunching of broken glass under boots, slowly getting closer. A door creaked open. "I told you," said the voice, now much closer. "You should have tried the pie." I slowly turned my head, each movement sending a sharp pain down my neck. The man from the diner was crouched next to the broken window of my car, his face bearing that same wide, unnatural grin. His eyes, black like oil, reflected nothing. "No," he said, stretching a hand toward me with long, pale fingers. And then, that children's song started to play again, clearer than ever. "Ashes, ashes, we all fall down." I felt his fingers touch my arm, and my vision began to darken. The next morning, after a sleepless night, I tried to convince myself it had all been a dream, the farm, the shadows, the eyes, the voices. Maybe my mind had just cracked under the stress and isolation. I drove to a cafe in a nearby town, hoping to find some sense of normalcy amidst the noise of the place. The tables were full of people having breakfast. The clink of cups and plates made me feel a little more human. But the normalcy didn't last. As I sipped my coffee, I noticed someone sitting across the room. A man in a worn brown jacket, disheveled in appearance. But what really caught my attention was the way he was looking at me. It wasn't a casual glance. It was intense, fixed, as if he were trying to memorize every detail of my face. I ignored the urge to confront him, quickly paid my bill, and left the cafe. Outside, the cool breeze on my face allowed me to relax for a moment. But when I turned toward my car, the man was there, standing just a few feet away. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, his voice rough, laden with warning. "Who are you?" I asked, taking a step back. The man didn't answer immediately. He just lifted his chin, and that's when I saw it. His eyes were not normal. In his irises there was a strange pattern, like intertwined lines that moved slowly, almost imperceptibly. "They don't forget," he said, "and they never forgive." "What are you talking about?" I demanded, though deep down, I already knew the answer. "The farm. The basement. What you released, it's with you now. It will always be with you." My heart sank. I wanted to scream that he was wrong, that I had left it all behind. But it was pointless. Deep down, I knew he was right. The man took a step closer, extending a crumpled piece of paper toward me. I took it with trembling hands. There was a drawing on it, a symbol identical to the one I'd seen in the basement, surrounded by human figures all facing inward. "This is the only thing that can stop them," he said. "But it will cost you more than you're willing to give." Before I could say anything else, he turned and disappeared into an alley. That night, I returned to the motel with the paper in my pocket, studying it over and over again. The symbol seemed to pulse when I looked at it, as if it had a life of its own. I turned on the bedside lamp and sat on the bed, determined to understand what it meant. But as I stared at it, the light began to flicker. The wind, the damned wind, returned, and with it came the voices. "You belong to us. You will never escape." The paper grew warm in my hands, and a sharp pain shot through my head. Shadows began to move across the walls, darker and more defined than ever before. I knew what I had to do. The figure of the man, his words, they all pointed to one destination, the farm. I drove all night, the symbol in the passenger seat, like a beacon guiding me toward the darkness. When I arrived at the farm, the dawn was just beginning to tint the sky. The air was thick, heavy with electricity, like the calm before a storm. I knew I wouldn't get another chance. I entered the basement, feeling each step take me closer to the end. I placed the paper with the symbol on the floor, right where the box had been. The shadows on the walls began to stretch and twist, forming humanoid figures that surrounded me. "Do you think you can stop us?" The voice boomed, louder than ever before. "I don't belong to you!" I shouted, throwing the knife into the center of the symbol. The shadows lunged toward me, and everything darkened. I woke up on the basement floor hours later. The air was still, the shadows had vanished, and the symbol on the paper had faded. I don't know if I stopped them or if I only delayed them, but something changed. I can feel it. But I know I'm not completely free. Something whispers to me in the moments of silence. Something telling me that this story isn't over. The farm is still there, waiting for the next unsuspecting victim. And me? I keep watching the shadows, waiting for the day they return for me. For weeks after my last encounter at the Henderson farm, I thought it was all over. The knife, the symbol, and my defiant act seemed to have pushed them away. I moved into a small apartment in the city, surrounded by constant noise and bright lights. The peace I felt was shallow, but it was enough to keep me functioning. However, it didn't take long before the signs started to return. The first night I noticed something strange was while I was walking back from work. I passed a dark alley, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw a tall, thin figure between the shadows. I froze, turning to look fully. It was a symbol, hand-drawn, the same one from the basement, with human figures. This time, a phrase was written beneath it. "We are always here." That night I couldn't sleep. The sound of the wind, the cursed wind, returned, whistling between the closed windows of my small apartment. The lights began flickering, and just after midnight, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps outside my door. I cautiously approached, the knife I had brought with me from the farm firm in my hand. My heart was beating so loudly, I thought it might explode. I looked through the peephole, nothing. But when I returned to my room, there was something written on the wall, as if it had been scratched with nails. "The sacrifice is never complete." The following days were a blur of chaos. Every night, the footsteps returned. The shadows on the walls twisted in impossible ways, and the voices grew clearer. No longer whispers, they were demands. "Finish what you started, or give us what belongs to us." I didn't know what they meant, what sacrifice, what belonged to them. I began to dig deeper, researching the town's archives where I had first read about the farm. This time, I searched through older documents, records speaking of disappearances in the area long before Henderson ever built the farm. What I found was terrifying. In the 17th century, settlers reported seeing dark figures in the nearby woods. There were stories of human sacrifices to appease them, offerings made on moonless nights. The very spot where the farm now stood, according to these records, was once the site of these rituals. One passage in particular froze my blood. "If the sacrifice is interrupted, they become bound to the one who disturbs them. They persist. They follow until it is completed or a replacement is offered." I had no escape. If I didn't finish this, they would follow me forever. And I didn't want to imagine what would happen if I gave up. The next night, with the knife in my hand and the symbol burned into my memory, I returned to the farm. Everything was as I had left it, but it felt different, heavier, more oppressive. As I entered the basement, the shadows were already there, waiting for me. I could feel their eyes, dozens, maybe hundreds, staring at me from the walls. "I'm here," I said, my voice trembling. "What do you want?" "Complete the sacrifice." The knife in my hand grew warm, as if it had a life of its own. The shadows began to move, swirling around me, closer with every second. I had no idea what to do, but something deep inside me, something primal, guided me. I drew the symbol on the basement floor with the knife, my hands shaking, but determined. When I finished, the shadows stopped. The air became so thick, I could barely breathe. Then I heard their voices again. "Choose." In front of me appeared two options. The first was a mirror. As I looked into it, I saw my reflection, but behind me were them, the figures with endless eyes, waiting for me. The second was a vague human figure. But, floating in an ethereal haze, like a ghost, I had no face. But I could still feel my humanity, my fear. The choice had to be made. One of us had to be sacrificed. In the end, I made my decision. I can't tell you what I chose. Maybe it was fear that guided me, or maybe something darker, something I don't even understand myself. When it was all over, the shadows faded away. The basement fell silent, and the air lightened again. But I wasn't the same anymore. I returned to the city, but nothing felt the same. I can't look into the mirror without feeling like something else is watching me. The lights in my apartment never seem to shine brightly enough. And every little noise in the night makes my nerves go on edge. The Henderson farm is still there, untouched. I don't know how long it will be before someone else is called to it, before another unsuspecting soul crosses its threshold. As for me, I'm still here, still living. But I'm not truly free. Sometimes I can feel its eyes on me, even in the crowds. It says without a doubt that one day they will return. I first noticed it at 11:47 p.m., the time on my phone. The fluorescent lights at Jefferson Station buzzed above me, casting everything in a washed-out, artificial glow. There were just 3 other people waiting on my platform, a nurse, likely coming off a hospital shift, and an elderly couple snuggled up on a bench, probably exhausted from a long day. I, too, was drained, barely able to keep my eyes open after another late day in the office. Then, something on the opposite platform caught my attention. A man stood perfectly still, staring directly at me. At first, I thought I was imagining things due to fatigue, but no, his gaze was locked on me with unsettling intensity. He wore dark clothing that hung loosely on his thin frame, a baseball cap pulled low over his forehead, obscuring most of his face. But I could feel his eyes drilling into me. A chill ran down my spine. I shifted my position and pretended to focus on my phone, trying to ignore the growing unease. When I looked up again, he hadn't moved an inch. The station speaker crackled. "Northbound train approaching." The rumble of the incoming train reverberated through the platform, but I kept my gaze straight ahead, deliberately avoiding looking at the other side of the tracks. The train screeched to a halt, and I boarded the second car, choosing a seat near the central doors. I pulled out my phone again, hunched over it, hoping to calm my nerves. Just as the doors started to close, I heard heavy footsteps entering the car. I didn't need to look to know it was him. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as he passed my row. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him sit 2 rows behind me, on the other side of the aisle. My heart began to race. I told myself I was being paranoid. Lots of people take the train late at night, and it meant nothing that someone had gotten on the same car. But my instinct screamed that something was wrong. The train sped off, leaving the station behind. Through the reflection in the window, I could see him. He wasn't looking around like a normal passenger. His eyes were still fixed on me, never blinking. His face remained mostly hidden under the cap, but his unmoving posture made it feel as if he was watching me, following me. I opened my work email on my phone, trying to act calm, even though my mind was racing. There were still 4 stops left before mine, and the car wasn't full. There were just enough people to make me feel a bit safer. A nurse sat at the far end of the car, and a group of college kids joked in the front. An elderly man napped near the doors. When we reached the next station, I made a decision. If this man followed me when I changed cars, I would know for sure that it wasn't a coincidence. I stood up as the train slowed down, grabbed my bag, and quickly walked toward the door leading to the next car. As I crossed to the other side, I looked for a new seat. 10 seconds. 15 maybe? Perhaps I was being paranoid after all. Then the door between cars slowly opened. His gaze met mine immediately. He sat directly across from me, just 1 seat ahead, on the other side of the aisle. My mouth went dry. The car was almost empty now, just the two of us. There were 2 stops left. I could feel sweat beading on my forehead. I typed a quick message to Mark, just to remind myself that he was visiting his parents this weekend. The train reached the penultimate stop. I stayed frozen, gripping my bag tightly, not daring to move. The man stood from his seat and walked toward me. But he didn't stop. He moved behind me, and I could hear his slow, uneven breathing, as if he was trying to control it. The train plunged into darkness for a moment as the fluorescent lights flickered. Something brushed the back of my neck, sending a jolt of fear through me. I spun around, but he was still standing there, motionless. The speaker crackled again. "Next stop, Central Station." As the train slowed down, I stood up and walked toward the doors. I could feel him moving behind me. The doors opened with a soft hiss, and I stepped out onto the platform, forcing myself to maintain a normal pace. His footsteps echoed behind me. The station was nearly empty, save for a janitor pushing a cleaning cart. I quickened my pace, sensing him drawing closer. When I reached the main entrance of the lobby, I broke into a run. The sound of my shoes slapping against the tile floor mixed with the heavier thud of his steps behind me. I rounded the corner, almost crashing into a trash can. The man caught up to me. Something hit me in the back, sending me sprawling to the floor. My bag flew out of my hand. Before I could get up, I felt hands gripping my shoulders, and then my face. It wasn't my reflection, but his. His eyes, his nose, his jawline, it was all the same, but his skin was pale, almost translucent, like it hadn't seen the light of day in years. Dark circles lay under his eyes, and though his hair was similar to mine, it was dull and unkempt. He smiled at me and his cracked lips revealed yellowed, crooked teeth. Finally, I caught up to him, his voice cold and hollow, like a rough imitation, as if he wasn't used to speaking. "Do you know how long I've been searching? How many stations I've waited at? How many trains I've taken?" His breath smelled of rusted metal. I tried to struggle, but his grip was surprisingly strong. "Who are you?" I managed to scream, my voice breaking. "What do you want? Don't you remember?" he asked, leaning closer. His smile widened, and his voice dropped to a whisper, full of resentment. "The mistake at the hospital. 2 babies so alike they could have been twins. One went home with a wealthy family. The other," his fingers dug painfully into my shoulders, "the other ended up in the foster system." He continued, his voice trembling with rage. "Home to home, school to school, always out of place, never enough. But I figured it out. I found the records. I found you." My head was spinning. "You're crazy," I said, struggling to free myself. "This is impossible. Impossible. Look at me. Look at me closely. We could have been twins. We should have been twins. But they gave you my life." He snarled. From his pocket, he pulled something that gleamed under the dim light. A knife, its blade cold and sharp. "Well, tonight I'm going to take it back," he said. I felt the cold metal against my throat, a drop of hot blood slipping down my neck. I didn't scream. In a desperate move, I slammed my head forward, hitting his face. He screamed and staggered back, clutching his nose. I seized the moment, freeing one of my arms, and drove an elbow into his ribs. We both tumbled to the ground, wrestling for the knife. I managed to stand swaying, my body burning with pure hatred. "Security!" I screamed with all my might. My voice echoed in the empty lobby. "Help!" He ignored me, lunging at me again. I rolled to the side, reaching for my bag. I struck his head with the edge of the briefcase. A dry crack filled the air as he collapsed, motionless, onto the floor. I stood there, panting, the bag still in my hands. Blood began to pool around his head. Finally, hurried footsteps filled the air. 2 security guards appeared at the corner, their flashlights illuminating the scene. One of them gasped at the sight of the body on the floor. "What the hell happened here?" he asked, reaching for his radio. I collapsed, trembling. "He tried to kill me," I croaked. The next few hours passed in a blur, statements being taken, paramedics checking my wounds, detectives asking endless questions. When they finally let me go, it was morning. The rising sun cast a warm light over the world, but I couldn't escape the shadow of what had just happened. At home, I collapsed in front of the bathroom mirror. My reflection stared back at me, a bruised face, a split lip, eyes filled with terror. For a moment, I thought I saw him again, smiling behind me, but it was just my imagination. Since that day, I stopped taking the train. I started driving to work, even though parking downtown cost a fortune. Some nights, I still check the shadows, waiting to see him again. I feel the darkness closing around me, as if his cold fingers are about to touch my neck once more. I wonder if things could have been different. If I had grown up with resentment, would I have turned into him? I don't want to know the answer. Weeks have passed since that night at the station. Sometimes, I wake up in the middle of the night, gasping, feeling as if his hands are still on my shoulders. The doctors say the tremors in my hands will fade over time. They also say the nightmares should eventually stop, but I'm not so sure. Some things leave scars that never heal. I often find myself thinking about what he said, about the mistake at the hospital, about two lives that should have never crossed paths. The detectives confirmed that we weren't twins, that we weren't even related. We were just two people who looked eerily alike, born on the same day in the same hospital. But that resemblance drove him to obsession. They found his apartment, filled with photos of me, detailed notes about my routine, and recordings of my voice. He'd been studying it, practicing it. He had planned to replace me completely, to take my life as if it had always been his. He wasn't just a stranger to me. He had convinced himself that I had stolen something from him. And in his eyes, maybe I did. I no longer take the train. Not even when driving is inconvenient. I can't stand the thought of being on another car, surrounded by strangers. I've installed extra locks on all my doors, and cameras in the hallways of my building. I even changed my daily routine, just in case. But no matter what I do, some nights, when I pass by a mirror, I feel like he's still there, an ominous shadow lurking in my reflection, waiting for me.